Monster Madness.
If all you know about The Wicker Man is a bunch of silly memes of Nicolas Cage, then I'd be glad to let you know there's a classic film from 1973 that is much more worthy of attention. It's been relatively obscure, but over the years it's gained critical praise. Actor Christopher Lee, who's been in hundreds of films, had always maintained that this was his favorite. He was enthusiastic from the start, even working for free to help get it made. So is this Citizen Kane of horror films all it's cracked up to be? Depends which way you look at it. I don't really think it's a horror film. It's more like a suspenseful detective story that leads up to a great horror scene. It has a strange tone. I can't think of anything to compare it to other than the shitty remake, but let's forget about that. It's about a police officer named Howie, played by Edward Woodward, who's searching for a missing girl. His search leads him to a secluded island off the coast of Scotland that's owned by Lord Summerisle, played by Christopher Lee. He searches the whole island, asking everybody about the girl, but no one's seen her. Howie gets increasingly suspicious, and everywhere he goes, he notices everyone practicing pagan customs and rituals. He's opposed to all this, his culture clashing with theirs, so he takes on a disliking to the whole community. Eventually, he starts to believe that the girl is going to be part of a sacrifice. He finds her, and in one scene, he steals one of the costumes, and on his way to rescue her, has to run up and punch somebody out while in the disguise. This was the inspiration for the scene in the remake where Nicolas Cage punches someone in the bear costume. So yes, it was in the original, but just not as ridiculous. Well, something does happen at the end involving a sacrifice, and it's no surprise that somewhere in there, there's a Wicker Man. What is a Wicker Man exactly? Well, apparently the only historical record of one came from Julius Caesar, who claimed that during his war experiences in what is now France, local tribes burned criminals alive in a prison made of twigs in the shape of a man. Pretty grotesque idea, and that makes for an effectively disturbing scene, not to mention inspiring a great song by Iron Maiden. It's one of the best finales in a horror film, if you choose to give it the horror label. It builds up to it so well. They go to great lengths to explain why they're sacrificing and building up a feeling of tension and unease. First time I saw it, I didn't like it. I didn't see what the big deal was. But after rewatching it, I've come to appreciate it. I recommend it, especially because it's so critically acclaimed, but you have to keep in mind, it's not like any other horror film.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Mr. Sardonicus. Gotta love the name. This is another gimmicky, exploitive horror chiller from William Castle. It's about a doctor who gets a letter from his ex-girlfriend telling him to come to a remote castle in Europe where her husband, Sardonicus, the head of the castle, is in need of medical help. He goes along with it, arriving at the castle, which is full of all the spooky cliches you'd expect, including a suspicious manservant who's badly scarred. He meets Sardonicus, played by Guy Rolfe. No relation. He was in a lot of the Puppet Master sequels. Here, he's a wealthy but seclusive count, kind of like Dracula, but has his face covered with a mask like Phantom of the Opera to hide his terrible infliction. He explains what happened to him through a flashback. He had dug up the grave of his father because the father had a winning lottery ticket that was still in his pocket. You think they could have come up with a more interesting reason for him to dig up the grave, but it makes up for it with a freakishly weird death face. It's these kind of moments that stick out to me. I don't know whether to laugh or not. It's stupid, but it's so disturbing. Seeing this puts him into a state of shock, disfiguring his own face to be frozen forever in the same outrageous grin. The sinful act of robbing a grave classifies him as a ghoul, and that's why he is cursed to have that face. You don't see him unmasked very often. Apparently the makeup was extremely uncomfortable, I wouldn't doubt, so they kept it to a minimum, which maximizes its shocking effect. The face is the best part of the film. I wish the rest of it could have lived up more. The idea of a freaky grin was done way before in The Man Who Laughs from 1928, which was an inspiration for the Joker. Also, this guy tortures women by tying them up or hanging them in a room and putting leeches on them. Why does he do this? It has something to do with him using the women to find a cure for his face, but it doesn't make any sense at all. It's just a forced attempt to make him into a villain. He also threatens the doctor, forcing him into helping him. At least there, it gives a clear reason for his actions, but it's still weak. It's very important that Sardonicus is made into a ruthless villain because the whole gimmick at the end is that there's a punishment poll where the audiences supposedly get to decide the fate of Sardonicus. William Castle comes on screen, the showman that he is, and asks all the audiences to hold up their thumb cards, which they were given earlier. If you held it with the thumb facing up, you were voting to give Sardonicus mercy, but the thumb down meant no mercy. It seems stupid when you can just use your own thumb, but supposedly they were glow in the dark, just to make sure Mr. Castle can see your cards from up there on the movie screen. Obviously, he's not really there, but he's playing it up, joking like, hey, you in the back row, can you hold it up more? And then he starts counting them up and doing a bunch of fake math, and then he grins and says, no mercy it is. Then the ending plays where Mr. Sardonicus has no mouth, or thinks he has no mouth, and is forced into starving to death. I think they could have come up with something better. On the other hand, the mercy ending nobody has ever seen because it doesn't exist. Think about it. Imagine if they shot two endings, then somebody would have to count up all the votes and then have the projectionist thread up the right reel. Although there has been many rumors that the other ending is out there somewhere waiting to be found. Even though it was a total gimmick, it succeeded in giving the audiences the feeling that they were participating. Overall, it's a weak film. It takes a potential love triangle subplot and a forced villain and almost goes somewhere with it all, but falls flat. The doctor insists that Sardonicus' face is psychosomatic, that it's produced by his mind. This could have led to more interesting psychological twists, but nothing really happens. The best thing it has going for it is the freaky face and the atmosphere with the castle and cemetery. It has a classic feel. It's just a not-so-classic film. It's still very interesting. This is a piece of history right here. But here's a crazy idea. Instead of remaking so many films that already are masterpieces to begin with, what about a remake of Mr. Sardonicus, and maybe this time with a real multiple ending?
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Modern Monday.
This is Modern Mondays, where I'll be talking about films that are new. The Babadook is one of the few horror films in recent years to get tons of critical praise. It was the first feature film of Jennifer Kent, a great debut. But wow, the praise for this film has been overwhelming, winning and being nominated for all kinds of awards. The author of The Exorcist, William Friedkin, said it was the most terrifying film he ever saw. Is it that terrifying? Really? Personally, I don't find it really scary at all, though I do find it powerful and disturbing. That's a better word for it. It's about a widowed mother, Amelia, trying to raise her 6-year-old son, Samuel. The father was tragically killed in a car accident while they were on their way to the hospital to give birth to the son. All these years later, she's still so emotionally wrecked that every time Sam's birthday comes up, she avoids throwing him a party. The kid develops a problem. He's badly behaved, he speaks very bluntly, he throws fits, and he hurts other kids. One night, Sam finds a pop-up book called Mr. Babadook that he asks her to read to him. At first, it seems innocent and cute, but it's strangely dark, and it just keeps getting more and more disturbing as it goes on, until Sam is so scared out of his mind that she has to try and calm him with another book. Sam can't stop talking about Mr. Babadook, convinced that he's a real existing monster. Amelia rips up the book and throws it away, but somehow it keeps coming back. As the film progresses, she grows increasingly frustrated, then starts seeing visions of the Babadook herself as she slowly descends into madness. To narrate the rest of it step by step would only be doing it an injustice. Let me get straight to the opinion. The positives first. The design of the pop-up book is brilliant. It takes something so cartoonish and cute, but twists it into something terrifying. Everybody at one point as a kid must have read or seen something that scared them. It brought back memories, awakening some long-forgotten emotion deep inside me. The set design is also interesting. They built a fake house in a studio, painted only with dark, cold colors. I like how it's almost like the house itself is in black and white, just like the book. I like how when the movie begins, it seems like the kid is the problem, but as it goes on, your concern shifts from him to the mother. It works on the same psychological kind of level as The Shining, with the relationship between a parent and a young boy. That's the closest movie I can compare it to. It's like The Shining, except Amelia would have been both Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall at the same time. And that brings me to the actress, Essie Davis. First film I've ever seen her in, and wow, she's good, as in Academy Award good. Especially the later scenes when she's going crazy. The same way Jack Nicholson was such a large part to what made The Shining so great, she does the same. She carries the film. Now, for what I didn't like. The kid is annoying in the first act, maybe not in a bad way. He's annoying because he's a misbehaved kid, but I suppose that's the point, isn't it? But the big problem to me is, believe it or not, the monster, Mr. Babadook. I like the look. He's sort of a bit like Caligari and a little bit of Marilyn Manson, so he looks awesome. What I don't like is that the Babadook barely shows up, and when he does, he's not scary. I mean, why should I be scared? What does he do? He calls up on the phone and makes weird noises, or he hangs from the ceiling and goes boo. He doesn't kill anybody or give us any good reason why we should be afraid. My problem specifically is that the Babadook has nothing to do with the story. It's more like a melodrama about a dysfunctional family, or not even that. Some would just say it's just the common ordinary stress of motherhood. Take the Babadook out of it and you still have the same story. It was as if the film was meant to be a drama and they just decided to throw in the monster at the last minute. I don't think that's what happened, but from watching it, that's what it seems like. The monster comes off as if it was an afterthought. Since the film was advertised as a horror film with a creepy silhouette on the cover, that's what I expected. So I think it's a bit misrepresented. Not that it hurt the film in any way. Everyone still praised the ever-loving crap out of it. Great film, but if you compare it to the praise, I think it's a bit overrated.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Top 10 Tuesday.
I've been doing Monster Madness marathons for 10 years now, and in those 10 years I've reviewed a ton of horror movies, but my original intention was to recommend only the best. This is in case you're just getting into horror movies, or you're looking for some good ones that you might not have seen. But as the years went on, I started picking crappy movies too, to mix it up, and just to keep you entertained one way or another. It became more about just making your Halloween season a little more Halloween-y. Now that there's so many Monster Madness movies behind me, I'm a bit concerned that a newcomer could be overwhelmed by all the movies that I've spotlighted. That's why I'm dedicating these Tuesdays to top 10 lists, to narrow it down and leave you with the best of the best. Obviously, it's just an opinion. No matter how I rank these movies, no matter which order they fall in, it doesn't change that these are all movies I recommend. All these movies are great, but it comes down to which ones I recommend the most in order of priority. So let's go. It's Top 10 Tuesday. I've broken these lists into different horror periods. The way I see it, there's the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age. I should note that the Silent Age predates the Golden Age, and since we're short on time, I'll just go on record of saying Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, and Phantom of the Opera are the main essentials. If you're interested in silent antique horror, see those. Let's start with the Golden Age, which began in the 30s with the talkies, when movies with sound was a new invention. This is also when horror became a genre. Near the end of the 30s, the genre started to die down a bit, but came right back with all new commercial appeal. This leads into the 40s, and since the Golden Age roughly spans 2 decades and has 2 distinct movements, I feel it's best to split it up between the 30s and the 40s. So you get 2 top 10s today. Not a top 20 exactly, just 2 separate columns, 2 different top 10s, okay? So first up, the 30s. Oh boy, even this is tough. Here's some honorable mentions. The Black Cat, Dr. X, White Zombie, Murders in the Rue Morgue, M, Mad Love, Mystery of the Wax Museum, Island of Lost Souls, and Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a Sherlock Holmes movie. More like a mystery, but it has a horror atmosphere. Freaks. Many would say Freaks should make the list, but it's hard for me to place it above others when it's not really a full horror movie. It just happens to have a horror scene in it, the ending. But either way, I recommend it. Great movie. Okay, on to the list. Number 10, The Old Dark House. Atmosphere is the key word here. It's just a bunch of travelers stuck in a house during a thunderstorm with a very odd family. No music, just a steady soundtrack of wind and thunder. It's as classic as they come. Number 9, The Raven. Bela Lugosi plays a surgeon who's obsessed with the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. When his great love is denied of him, he becomes a mad lunatic, subjecting his victims to his house full of traps. He disfigures the face of a criminal played by Boris Karloff and forces him to carry out his evil plans. This is one of the rare instances where Lugosi gets to upstage Karloff, and I honestly think it's one of Lugosi's most sinister roles. Number 8, The Mummy. Ancient mummy Imhotep rises to search for the mummy of his beloved mummy princess, and then her reincarnation. Great on atmosphere, has a dreamlike quality. Karloff's voice has a hypnotic effect. Love the flashback scenes of ancient Egypt. But what makes it the most special is the original story that doesn't rely on any literary source. It has sort of a fairy tale quality, a love story that spanned thousands of years. Number 7, The Invisible Man. Based on the H.G. Wells story about a scientist who makes himself invisible but can't find the way back and grows increasingly mad and power-hungry. The special effects are impressive for 1933, and Claude Rains is absolutely fantastic as the Invisible Man. Number 6, a tie. Dracula, both the English and Spanish versions. These 2 films were made simultaneously, one the famous Bela Lugosi version with an English-speaking cast, and the other with a Spanish-speaking cast. The Spanish version is better in many ways, but the one that put Dracula into pop culture is the Lugosi version. Anytime somebody imitates Dracula, they're imitating Lugosi. The lack of music enhances the creepy mood. It may seem too slow for a modern audience, but if you're in the right mindset and you're looking for that good old-fashioned chilling atmosphere, then this is mandatory. This is the gold standard. Number 5, Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. Everybody knows the story of a scientist who creates a monster, but this is where all the famous tropes come from, like It's Alive, the angry mob of villagers, the burning windmill, the grave robbing, and all the loud machinery buzzing in that laboratory. Mary Shelley came up with the story and all the philosophical ideas behind it, but the movie is what made it as famous as it is. The classic image of the monster that we all know is Jack Pierce's makeup design for Boris Karloff. Number 4, Bride of Frankenstein. Very rare in horror films when the sequel surpasses it. For any of its Mary Shelley source material that it missed the first time around, this time it makes up for it with the monster's visit to an old blind man and the creation of the monster's mate. Karloff gets to speak this time, really getting the chance to shine, leading to more famous cliches like fire, bad, and all that. You sympathize more with the monster this time. It also introduces another mad scientist, Dr. Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger, who is so sinister and great, he actually upstages Colin Clive's Frankenstein. Lots of dark comedy, even religious symbolism. With this movie, there's always a lot to notice, to go back and rewatch. Number 3, Son of Frankenstein. I don't know how it happened, but the 3rd installment in the series, which is a semi-reboot, somehow surpasses them all. I didn't think so the first time I saw it because the monster is no longer the central focus. It's more about the three-way battle of wits between Frankenstein's son, played by Basil Rathbone, the Inspector Crow, played by Lionel Atwill, and the vengeful, broken-necked Igor, played by Bela Lugosi, one of his all-time greatest performances. The dialogue is well written, and the gothic sets and cinematography make for the perfect classic horror experience. Number 2. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Frederick March, in his dual role as Jekyll and Hyde, is so good he won an Academy Award, something that hardly ever happens with horror movies. Especially when he's Mr. Hyde, he is outstanding. He's such a horrible, despicable character. I'd say one of the best screen villains of all time. Everything else on the technical side, from the camera work to the makeup to the foggy sets, is all top-notch. And the number one 1930s horror film? King Kong, the classic story of Beauty and Beast. Yes, it's mostly a fantasy adventure film, but it has dinosaurs chowing down on people, gruesome close-ups of Kong putting people in his mouth and stomping them into the ground, and probably has more screaming than your typical slasher film, not just from the iconic Fay Wray, but the entire team of adventurers. This isn't just one of the best monster movies of all time. It's a contender for best film of all time. For 1933, what it accomplished was unbelievable. When sound films were relatively new, this has an entire musical score composed to match all the action, and with all the different types of dinosaur growls, it's a fully fleshed out sound design. And on the visual side, Willis O'Brien and his team had to work with a combination of all these new techniques. Stop motion, a giant puppet head of Kong, not to mention a giant hand and foot, composite shots, rear screen projection, front screen projection. They had to figure this all out. They pioneered the whole special effects industry. This film proved that cinema is a medium made for fantasy and imagination to show us things that could never exist in real life. It inspired Ray Harryhausen, Peter Jackson, Steven Spielberg, everybody. We owe everything to King Kong. Now, the top 10 of the 40s. The 40s horror movies were a more commercial venture, especially with Universal as the big monster movie machine. During World War II, the classic monsters weren't as scary, and by the end of the decade, they were played for laughs in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I can't call that one a horror film since there isn't any legitimate horror in it. Even when Costello is scared, it's played up for comedy, so I'm giving that an honorable mention. Number 10, Return of the Vampire. It's Lugosi as a vampire that's not Dracula, but almost is, and a werewolf thrown in for good measure. What more could you want? I love this film visually above all else. The cemetery and all the fog puts you in the perfect Halloween mood. It probably has more fog in it than John Carpenter's The Fog. If you want fog, this is the movie. Number 9. The Mummy's Hand. This is the first appearance of the mummy Karras, the more cliché version that's wrapped in bandages and goes around strangling people. His first outing is probably the best. There's a lot of comedy in this movie, but it never gets in the way too much. It also has a lot of action-adventure elements with a tinge of espionage and treasure hunting. I believe it may have been one of the many influences for Indiana Jones. Number 8. House of Frankenstein. Boris Karloff gives his final bow in the Frankenstein series, not as the monster, but this time as a mad scientist who wants to play a game of brain swapping. There's a love triangle between the Wolfman, a hunchback, and a gypsy girl. Dracula appears as a warm-up act in the beginning. The plot is kind of a mess, but that's what makes it really fun. Number 7. Cat People, from producer Val Lewton. Yes, it's about a woman who turns into a cat, but the supernatural elements are downplayed. It's not one of the most action-packed, exciting films of this decade. Not much really happens on screen, but what this movie did for the horror genre can't be ignored. It's all about the suspense. I also really like the follow-up, Curse of the Cat People, but that's not a horror film at all. It's a real touching story, but just happens to have a real misleading title. Number 6. The Body Snatcher, also Val Lewton and based on a Robert Louis Stevenson story. This is Karloff and Lugosi's final film together, though Lugosi is wasted in a minor role. Karloff plays a body snatcher who robs graves to sell the bodies to doctors. It has some parts that drag, but every scene with Karloff is so great. He always has that sinister, shit-eating grin. Number 5. The Beast with Five Fingers. The best of the Killer Hand movies. The first act is slow, but give it time and it gets good. I think it's Peter Lorre's finest performance in a horror film. What makes it great is that you never know if he's really seeing the hand or he's going insane. Number 4. The Invisible Man Returns. Yeah, after including the first Invisible Man, can't forget about the sequel. Vincent Price plays a man who's wrongly accused of murder who becomes invisible to track down the real killer. Vincent Price is outstanding, especially when he starts going mad like his predecessor, and the special effects won an Academy Award. It's almost as good as the original. Number 3. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. This is the movie that got me into classic horror. It's a sequel to The Wolfman, but a reboot to the Frankenstein timeline. Here, the Wolfman is seeking a cure for his werewolf disease and seeks out Dr. Frankenstein, but instead meets his daughter and the monster. It opens with an excellent cemetery set and ends with an awesome showdown between the two monsters. This is what invented the versus movies and cinematic universes. Lots of fun. Number 2. Jekyll and Hyde. I didn't plan it this way, but once again, we have a Jekyll and Hyde movie coming in at number 2. It's almost the same as the 30s movie. I've always felt conflicted about it. Like, what's the point of remaking it so soon and so similar? Well, because of Spencer Tracy. Holy crap, he's amazing. And all around, it's a technically well-made movie. A real big-budget feel with class and elegance. Number 1. The Wolfman. Nothing represents 1940s horror to me more than The Wolfman. This is the one that all the rest branched out from and that made a star out of Lon Chaney Jr. He's very charismatic. You really care for his character and feel bad for him when he becomes the wolf. I like the pace. I like how it builds up to his first werewolf transformation, even though it lacks a good close-up transformation, and believe it or not, there's no shot of the full moon. Still, this is the all-time werewolf masterpiece, never surpassed. Whew, well, there you go. Next Tuesday, we get into the Silver Age, the first half of the Silver Age. And if you want to know more about any of these films, most of them I reviewed in the past, sometimes even outside of Monster Madness. So if you want more details on any of these films, search for my full reviews on Cinemassacre.com.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. What the Fuck Wednesday?
Welcome to What the Fuck Wednesdays, where I'll be trying to diagnose some of the strangest horror films ever made, the kind which are almost impossible to review. First up is Eraserhead by David Lynch. Is it a horror film? Well, it definitely has the look, the sound, the mood, the gore, and enough disturbing elements to make it a horror film, but it doesn't follow any formula and is too abstract and surreal to give it a genre. It exists in its own world. The plot, at its simplest, is basically about a guy, Henry Spencer, who impregnates his girlfriend, and she gives birth to something that doesn't resemble a human very much, and he's left with the parenting duties to look after it. Nothing else makes itself explicitly clear. We don't know exactly when or where the film takes place, but wherever it is, it's very gloomy with a dark dystopian feel. It's not even clear if the characters really belong to this world or not. Spencer always has this unsure look on his face, as if everything around him is strange, but we watch him do mundane tasks such as carrying groceries to his apartment. He has dinner with his girlfriend's parents, and they're serving little tiny chickens. He hesitates for a moment and asks, "Do you cut them up like regular chickens?" So there's some acknowledgement that this is all weird. The pace is incredibly odd. There's no dialogue until about 10 minutes in. Most of the time, what you hear is a densely layered, dark ambient soundtrack, and when people do talk, there's long pauses between their lines. Characters stare at one another with stone faces or funny grins. Even though it's largely abstract, there's enough of a plot to keep you on board. With some films that go for complete absurdity, it's easy to dismiss them. They mean nothing. But this film, it feels like there's something more to it. It makes you go, hey, where is this all going? This might be one of the most disturbing films I've ever seen, mostly because the baby, this thing creeps me out. It looks kind of like E.T., but not only does it look creepy, it makes you feel sorry for it. It's such a sad, pathetic creature, and it's clearly in pain the whole time. To describe the most horrific scene might spoil it, so if you've never seen it and want to be surprised, consider this a spoiler alert. It's when Spencer opens the bandages around the child and sees that its body is just a sack of guts and the bandages were holding it together. Then he forces himself to pick up a sharp instrument and put the child out of its misery. It bothers me just thinking about it. I can't say for sure if the film has a deeper meaning, but it seems to have something to do with the fear of parenting. I like the black and white look. Visually, it's amazing. The mood is strong. It feels not like you're watching a film, but that you're having a nightmare, and it definitely gets a legitimate reaction. Back in 1977, this was a groundbreaking achievement. I think today, if someone were to try a similar film, it wouldn't work. This is the type of film that can't exist today. It will always be one of a kind.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Bloodthirsty Thursday.
Every Thursday this month, I'll be spotlighting Dracula and vampire-related films. It's Bloodthirsty Thursdays. To start it out, we have one of the first sound vampire films ever made, Vampire. It almost was the first. It was being worked on at the same time Dracula was being made, but released after in 1932. The reason to watch it is for the surreal, dreamlike mood. The plot is weak and sort of confusing. I don't think anyone has ever done a synopsis on the film and had it make a whole lot of sense, though the basic setup is very simple. It's about a man, Alan Gray, who arrives at an inn next to an old castle. He finds shadows wandering about. A strange man gives him a vampire book. There's a sick woman who has the vampire bite marks on her neck. There's a doctor treating her with blood transfusions donated from Gray, but he's also caught giving her what seems to be poison, and he's working with an old woman who is supposed to be the vampire of the film, though you hardly ever see her. Next thing, Gray is in a coffin all of a sudden, and then there's a giant face in the window. What is going on? I wonder if the doctor himself is the vampire. With the blood transfusion, he's taking blood, but instead of giving blood back, he's giving poison. That's basically what a vampire does. They poison the person's soul. They curse them. It's my half-cooked theory that the movie is about the superstition against medical science. That just occurred to me. I don't know. But one of the things that makes the film so surreal is the lack of sound. To begin with, it's an early sound movie, but it's almost a silent film. There's lots of text. We're always looking at the vampire book, reading about all the mythology of the vampire. There's a music score, but hardly any sound effects, and dialogue is kept to a minimum. It was a German and French production, so the plan was to dub the actors' voices for all the different languages. No known English version survives, but either way, all the audio was recorded in post, so whenever anyone speaks, which is rare, the voices have this slightly weird dubbed feel, which adds to the surreal quality. There's lots of camera movement, which is ambitious for its time. With most old movies, the camera is always locked down. We usually watch everything from a fixed viewpoint as if we were watching a play, because that's what audiences were used to. Movies were a new thing, but here the camera is constantly following people around. There's POV shots. It's very advanced. The best part, which is one of the creepiest scenes ever in a 30s horror film, is when Gray is in the coffin. It's some kind of dream scene where he has a vivid experience of being carried to his grave. There's the image of his face laying there with his eyes wide open, and the POV shots looking up through the window in the coffin as it's being carried is very effective. It was written, produced, and directed by Carl Theodor Dreyer, or Dreyer. I've heard both ways pronounced. He's one of the film professor favorites, praised as one of the all-time greats because of his 1927 silent film epic, Passion of Joan of Arc. Unlike that film, this was a total critical failure. When it came out, people hated it. Audiences booed at it. Supposedly there was a riot one time and Dreyer had a mental breakdown. But after all these years, its obscurity has made it more interesting. People now look back at it with a fresh new appreciation. It's a really odd film. There's nothing else like it. I recommend it, but you have to be in the right mood, and you have to like slow-moving, atmospheric horror. Even being a huge fan of this type of genre, even for me, it's not the easiest film to watch. It requires a lot of patience, and still, I don't really know what to make of it, but I find it fascinating.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Franken Friday.
It's Franken Friday. If you're a newcomer to Monster Madness, you gotta check out all my old reviews of the classic Frankenstein films. I've done detailed reviews of the entire Universal series, plus the Hammer series, plus a bunch of other ones like Edison's Frankenstein from 1910, Frankenstein 1970, Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein, Frankenstein Unbound, Dracula vs. Frankenstein. I've covered a lot. But there's always more, and hey, this year marks the 200th anniversary of when Mary Shelley began writing the novel. Here's one in particular that's been on the to-do list for years. Frankenhooker. When you hear the name Frankenhooker, you can't help but laugh. It's gotta be terrible, right? But the question is it the right kind of terrible? Is it worth your time? Nowadays, there's so many crazy movies out there, all these shark movies, for example, movies that are trying to be bad on purpose. But I guess back in 1990, the market wasn't as oversaturated as it is now. Yes, VHS rentals were huge, and there were all kinds of crazy movies out there, but if you were walking through a video store and saw Frankenhooker on the shelf, it was a big deal. There was a quote from Bill Murray saying, "If you see one movie this year, see Frankenhooker." Bill Murray knows what's up. Anyway, after some skepticism, I watched it and I was amazed how entertaining it is. It's way better than it needs to be, and it's from the director of Brain Damage and Basket Case, so you know you're on the right track. I think this is his best one. The main character is Jeffrey Franken, who's about to be married, but his fiancée is killed by an accident with a lawnmower. So then he tries to bring her back to life, converting his garage into a mad scientist laboratory and going on a quest for body parts. He only uses her original head, but everything else he assembles from parts of hookers, because he's trying to take it all a step further and create the perfect body, an arm here, a leg there. So he pays for all these hookers and he's checking them all out. I mean, getting up all close and examining them all over. They think it's just his thing. Like, he's dressed as a doctor. I gotta check you out. It's such an uncomfortable but hilarious scene. And then he kills them in the most innocent way that he could possibly come up with. He's not a bad guy. He just wants to bring his girl back. Unlike Peter Cushing's Frankenstein, who would kill anybody without giving it a thought, this guy is worried about killing people, so he gives the hookers crack, but it's an explosive kind of crack. His reasoning is that the hookers are already killing themselves with crack. He's only speeding up the process. So this leads up to the best scene. All the hookers explode. Boom! 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 It's fucking great! The bodies look like mannequins, and in the DVD extras, the special effects guy says they were going for a fake look on purpose because, for one reason, they were trying to get an R rating, not X or NC-17. And NC-17 went into effect that same year, 1990. But also, they wanted the scene to be funny. And it is. Even when you know it's coming, it's still outrageous, even without any blood. Then Jeffrey goes into the lab with all the body parts. There's actually a pile of tits. Name another movie to have a pile of tits. So he stitches her together, zaps her full of electricity, all that, and brings her to life. She now has bluish purple hair for some reason. He tries talking to her, but because she's made of hooker parts, all she can say is, "Need some company? Looking for some action? Got any money?" She escapes the garage and gets loose in New York City. She's staggering around in the alleyways saying, "Want a date?" And somebody does take her up on the offer. Oh man, the ending I won't even try to explain. It needs to be seen to be believed. The whole concept is as ridiculous as it sounds, but considering that, it's surprisingly well made. Everything from the production design to the acting is all in tune with one another, creating a sleazy world with a consistent tone. The makeshift laboratory looks just like something somebody could have actually made out of scraps and all kinds of machinery parts, like an old freezer. The alleyways and hotel rooms are all littered with filth. Every wall is covered in writing, and down to every little dirty detail like an old cigarette machine in the corner. It's as if the whole film is coated in filth. The actor who plays Jeffrey, James Lawrence, is perfect for the part. He's naturally funny without appearing like he's trying to be funny. Patty Mullen, who plays the Frankenhooker, is a little more goofy. She's always doing this twitch with her face, but it starts to grow on you. You can tell she must have had a really good sense of humor. The film creates a lot of mixed emotions. It's disturbing, uncomfortable, but highly entertaining, and makes you feel dirty for liking it.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Today, there's no monkeying around. A lot of the films I review on Monster Madness are an acquired taste, but Mighty Joe Young from 1949 is a masterpiece that I think everyone should see. I've already reviewed King Kong and Son of Kong, so I don't feel right closing out Monster Madness before giving respects to Mighty Joe Young. In a way, it's third in the Kong series, the last of a trilogy. The story has no relation to Kong, but it has a similar plot, and the creative team behind the Kong films also worked on it. Ernest Schoedsack and Marion C. Cooper return, this time with Schoedsack directing and Cooper producing. Also, Willis O'Brien is back one final time doing the special effects. He had many assistants, one of which was Ray Harryhausen, his first big break. Harryhausen was a young boy when he saw Kong, so it was a dream come true to work under Willis O'Brien. I've already explained in my Kong review all the different techniques they had to invent, but now they've perfected them. There are many parts where the live actors are interacting with the stop motion in ways that look incredibly challenging. Robert Armstrong, who played Carl Denham in the Kong films, is back again, playing almost the same character, a businessman who wants to put on a big show and wants to make a fortune. This time he's a nightclub owner named Max O'Hara who travels to Africa to find animals for his new jungle-themed nightclub in Hollywood. There, his team confronts a giant ape and tries to capture it, but his friend Jill Young comes to the rescue, calling him by name, Joe. Earlier, we see her as a little girl raising Joe as a baby, which her father disapproves of, but caves in and lets her keep it. It's a very charming opening for a very charming movie. Joe is as obedient as a dog and super lovable, but he does have a temper when he feels threatened. He lives with Jill on her African ranch. O'Hara and company have a sit-down with her and peacefully negotiate a deal for her to come out to Hollywood with Joe and perform at the nightclub. With visions of being rich and living a glamorous life, she accepts. The nightclub is fully decked out with indoor trees, bamboo walls, and live lions behind glass. There's lots going on, and we get a great tour of the environment, giving us the sense that we're really there. Even the little vignettes of people talking, the people who we only see for a few seconds, even they're entertaining. Then Joe makes his appearance by coming up from under the stage lifting a piano played by Jill. The crowd is filled with wonder, just as we are. The image of Joe holding her up like that is somehow both epic and humble at the same time. It's an iconic film moment to me. Another great highlight is a bunch of strongmen, each demonstrating their ability one after another, and then engage in a tug-of-war with Joe. From a technical side, it's pretty impressive when you stop and think. There's a stop-motion animal holding one end of the rope, but real people holding the other. All the nightclub scenes are so entertaining, you could just have that without any plot, and it would still be awesome. Jill finds out that being famous isn't as great as she thought. She's had more attention than she bargained for, and Joe has to live behind a cage. They both miss their humble life on the ranch. As the performances go on, they become less enchanted with the whole thing. Audiences are throwing things, especially one rowdy group that are drunk off their asses. They sneak backstage later and give Joe some trouble. He gets so mad he breaks down the bars and chases them through the nightclub. It turns into a full rampage with everything getting destroyed. The lions get loose and Joe has to fend them off, and there's a great traveling shot following Joe as he swings on a rope. It's a spectacular melee. Afterwards, a court orders Joe to be executed. Jill begs to save his life, but is denied. This is when O'Hara stops being a businessman and becomes the hero he needs to be to help Joe escape from the authorities. But how does it all turn out? You'll just have to see. This is a milestone motion picture, on par with the original Kong, and that's saying a lot. Every scene is entertaining. Even the most minor characters are memorable. It never drags. It's full of all the laughs, thrills, and romance that's required in an American movie classic. Everything about it is top-notch.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Director Wes Craven has brought us some truly original, terrifying films, from Last House on the Left to Nightmare on Elm Street. But Swamp Thing is something entirely different. This is a more humorous film, whether intentional or not, and it has a campy tone. It's based on the DC comics of the same name. It features a monster that has some special place in the timeline of movie monsters, particularly the slimy green variety that live in the swamp or are caused by chemical mutations. This is the missing link between the creature from the Black Lagoon and the Toxic Avenger. Dr. Alec Holland is a scientist stationed in the Louisiana swamps. He's working on a top-secret formula. A government agent, Alice, arrives just in time to see his major breakthrough, but also a terrorist group arrives to steal the formula. Alec is covered in chemicals and left to die in the swamp, but instead becomes the mutated plant superhero, the Swamp Thing. Alec and Alice, couldn't those names be any more different? They share a Beauty and Beast type relationship as he fights off the terrorists. The effects are on par with many of the 50s monster movies, but not necessarily rising too far above it. Swamp Thing is featured predominantly. It's not one of those movies where you only see the monster sporadically. He's the main attention and always seen in bright daylight. There's lots of fun action sequences, including boat chases and explosions, but the best part is when the criminal leader gets mutated into some kind of hairy beast and fights Swamp Thing. You gotta love two people in monster suits battling it out. If somebody walked in on this scene, it would be one of those "what the fuck are you watching" kind of moments. There are two cuts of the film, the PG-rated theatrical cut and an extended cut that contains nudity. The old DVD had the extended cut, but the cover incorrectly said it was rated PG. Someone rented it from Blockbuster Video and complained, so the DVD had to be recalled. Rather than reprinting the cover, they remanufactured the DVDs to contain the theatrical cut instead. This is no major monster classic or a landmark superhero. Don't expect anything that great, But if you want something cheesy, check it out.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Modern Monday.
What I like about Kevin Smith movies is that you never know what to expect. Every movie he makes is so different than the last. Whether you like the movie or not, there's always a reason to keep coming back because you might like the next one. Red State was his first horror film, and I thought it was really good for the most part. Then when I heard he was doing another horror film, Tusk, I was interested, but I was very skeptical over the idea. It's about a guy who gets turned into a walrus. How is that going to work? The idea started with Kevin and company joking around on his podcast, Smodcast. It was in response to a prank ad, and they just made a funny, hypothetical story about it, and then asked fans if they'd be interested in seeing it made into a film. Well, it got made, that's for sure, and surprisingly, I think it came out really good considering how absurd an idea it was. The plot is about a podcaster, Wallace, played by Justin Long. He basically makes fun of people who are the subject of viral videos. There's a video of a kid who accidentally chops off his leg with a sword, and Wallace and his partner Teddy, played by Harry Joel Osment, ridicule the poor kid and laugh about it. So right off the bat, Wallace is made into the guy you're supposed to hate, a cold, heartless character with no sympathy or remorse. He takes it a step further when he goes on a trip to Manitoba, Canada, to exploit the kid face to face. But the kid commits suicide before he arrives, and Wallace is really bummed out. Not because the kid committed suicide, but because he didn't get to do his show and flew to Manitoba for no reason. So you can tell right away this is one of those stories about a horrible person who's going to get what they deserve. While in Manitoba, looking for a new subject, he finds an ad from an oceanic adventurer named Howard who's retired and is offering a free room in return for the opportunity to pass on his stories to someone. So Wallace heads over and has lengthy conversations with him. Howard, played by Michael Parks, tells him a story about how a walrus saved his life after being shipwrecked. Things take a turn when Howard puts something in Wallace's tea that makes him pass out. He wakes up to find that Howard has amputated his leg. It almost seems like an appropriate punishment for the way he treated the boy earlier, but it's more like a coincidence because what happens next, Howard removes more limbs and surgically reorients the bones and flesh in a way that begins to make him into a walrus. And once you get that reveal, my oh my, holy shit, I don't know whether to laugh or what. I'm confused. This is a film of all kinds of tonal shifts, but this is the most drastic shift of them all. The walrus costume is so strangely funny, but also so horribly disturbing. Somehow his face is able to emote so much pain through all the prosthetics and makeup. I like how the longer you see it, the more you start to notice ears and bits of other body parts stitched and patched all over it. Wouldn't that suck? If you were going to get turned into a walrus, couldn't it at least be a perfectly normal walrus, not a stitched up, bleeding bag of shit? The whole thing kind of reminds me of Human Centipede and the Fly remake. Also a little of Misery with somebody being captured. One of the scariest parts to me is when he's forced to swim, and while he's underwater he sees the skeletal remains of other possible failed experiments. This is a film with many long scenes. That could be a bad thing, except when you have such great actors. Michael Parks and Jason Long are both excellent. I like how they give Howard some kind of strange motive for turning Wallace into a walrus. He wants to relive the experience he had with the walrus that saved him. While living on an island, he had to eat the walrus to stay alive. But it was his friend, so he wants to give the walrus a second chance. So he makes another walrus human flesh costume for himself and engages in mortal combat with Wallace. The least interesting scenes follow his girlfriend who's cheating on him with his podcast partner Teddy. They find out he's in trouble, so they go on a search which brings them to an investigator played by Johnny Depp who's hunting Howard. He's the Van Helsing or Dr. Loomis. With a big star like that in a low-budget film, Well, 3 million, I think, but that's extremely low for major Hollywood standards. But anyway, in a film with this kind of budget, you'd think Johnny Depp would be the highlight. He's not, for me at least. His acting comes off as sort of an exaggerated caricature. I don't know, just doesn't do it for me. One thing I didn't get was that there's a beverage that appears all over the film. Wallace especially is always drinking it. I'm sure there's a reason, but I don't know what it is. I imagine it's similar to the Cornetto ice cream in the Edgar Wright trilogy with Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. Likewise, this is part of a trilogy called the True North trilogy. I have yet to see the others. From what I understand, Yoga Hosers is out, and coming next is Moose Jaws. Yeah, Moose Jaws. One more thing I didn't like was the non-linear Christopher Nolan-esque editing where it jumps back and forth in time. I think that style only works for certain kinds of films. It depends. Overall, Tusk is not perfect by any means, but I find it to be fascinating. It holds my attention completely. Kevin Smith has said with less money to work with, it results in a more original film. You could take more risks. Lots of times you get silly movie ideas in your head. I have thousands that all go to waste. We all know that not every idea should be made into a film, but sometimes, why the hell not?
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Top 10 Tuesday.
Here's my top recommendations for the Silver Age of horror films. The Silver Age, to me, spans the 50s and 60s. There's a lot of different genres that overlap here, so it's a bit complicated to nail down without two separate videos. This was the Atomic Age, so the horror genre almost went away during the 50s and instead adapted itself to the fear of nuclear devastation and the idea of scientific advancements that dare to go too far. The horrors of this time were either created in a lab or came from outer space to kill us all. Horror overlaps with science fiction, so this can get confusing. I'm breaking it up between the sci-fi films of the 50s and the horror movies of the 60s, which will also include the Hammer films. Hammer is when the genre got back to traditional horror, but since the Hammer films began in the late 50s, they would have been included here, but for now, we're talking sci-fi. This also means some of the great Vincent Price classics like House of Wax and House on Haunted Hill aren't going to make the cut. Can't forget about those, but they don't fit in here. So anyway, next time we'll get to the 60s and all of Hammer. So now, on to the 50s. And even here, I feel the need to divide it into 3 parts. 3 separate top 5s. 15 total. 5 for each subgenre. Alien invaders, monsters on the loose, and scientific disasters. Got it? So okay, first up, top 5 alien invaders. Honorable mention goes to Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space, where aliens raise the dead. I can't call it one of the best because it's so well known for being bad, but it's so entertaining. It's full of memorable quotes and blunders. It's best enjoyed on repeat viewings. It was also very inspirational to me in my teen years because Ed Wood didn't have a huge Hollywood budget, yet he tried to do it anyway. It shows ambition and passion above all technicalities. To fully understand its cult appeal, I highly recommend the documentary Flying Saucers Over Hollywood, the Plan 9 companion. Number 5. Earth versus the Flying Saucers. As far as your typical aliens come down and try to destroy everything scenario goes, this is the prime example. The characters are bland, but the Ray Harryhausen special effects are the real star. It's a feast to the eyes. Seeing these saucers blasting buildings, it's awesome. The final sequence where they attack Washington, D.C. is so iconic that it was somewhat remade with Independence Day 40 years later. Number 4. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The concept is still the same. The aliens come down to take over the Earth, but this is less action-oriented and a bit smarter. Here the aliens take over human likenesses in a very sophisticated attempt at replacing us. The idea that your friend might be an extraterrestrial was a scary concept that really caught on with audiences. Number 3. The Thing from Another World. It's sadly overshadowed by the John Carpenter remake, which is great in its own way, but this one is less about special effects and more about suspense, and innovative for its overlapping dialogue, a trademark of Howard Hawks films. This could also be viewed as a Monster on the Loose film, but it begins as a scientific study of an extraterrestrial shipwreck, and there's a large emphasis on the fact that it's a being from another world, and the debate whether we can communicate with it or not, and you can't forget the final chilling line, "Watch the skies." Number 2. The Day the Earth Stood Still. This is the only one on the list where the alien is not trying to kill us, but to deliver a message to save us from destroying ourselves. It has all the great cheesy things that you'd want to see, like a glowing saucer-shaped ship, a laser-shooting robot named Gort, but that's all surface stuff. To know why it's such a masterpiece, you just gotta see it. It's debatable for the number 1 spot. Number 1. War of the Worlds. This is the best of the hostile kind of aliens. It's based on the H.G. Wells novel. This is way ahead of its time, with color cinematography and with special effects and sound design that are on par with Star Wars. For 1953, it is incredible. The look of the spaceships is totally unique, not the stereotypical saucer shape. The laser sounds are some of the best sound effects ever, and the magnitude of the destruction caused by the aliens has never been more ominous. It's depicted as a full-on disaster, a battle that humanity can't win. None of these movies ever got the Monster Madness treatment, but that was because I covered all of them in a 3-part series where I compared classic Alien Invader movies with their remakes. Look up Alien Invaders on Cinemassacre.com. Now, top 5 monsters on the loose. This is any movie where there's a monster going around terrorizing people and not necessarily giant-sized. Because there's so many, I have to give an honorable mention to Rodan and 20 Million Miles to Earth, which overlaps with the Alien Invader genre, though that would never exclude it from either list. The monster can still be from space. Number 5. Them. Giant killer ants. There were tons of giant insects in the 50s, but this is the best of the bunch. It doesn't mean giant ants are any more cool than giant grasshoppers or spiders. In fact, I almost picked tarantula, but this is the most well-made of them all. It must have been an inspiration for James Cameron's Aliens. We have a young girl who's traumatized after her parents were killed. There's soldiers in dark caves going around with flamethrowers fighting the ants, and at the end, in a secret chamber, there's a queen ant laying eggs. So you can see all the similarities to Aliens. Number 4. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Nuclear bombs awaken a hibernating creature in the Arctic. It heads for New York City and destroys everything. The best part is the Ray Harryhausen special effects. The stop-motion animation is truly amazing. There's lots of detail going into it. For example, when the monster goes between buildings, he comes in and out of shadows. It's one great shot after another, a visual masterpiece. And it predates Godzilla, making it the original giant prehistoric reptile rampage. Number 3. The Blob. This is a monster that happened to come from space, but is mainly a Monster on the Loose film. What a great idea for a monster, a massive slime that sticks to people, devouring them and growing bigger. It's such a scary idea that it could ooze underneath a door or come through a drainage pipe. No matter where you go, you're not safe. The special effects are very low budget and makeshift. That's another thing appealing about it, that it's not a Hollywood film. It was made in Pennsylvania. But it's not about the effects, it's about the characters. The teenagers are the heroes in the movie, which was uncommon at the time. They're very likable, especially the star, Steve McQueen. There's lots of prank playing and jokes, but in the end, they all get together to save the town. I love how obvious it is as a product of the decade in which it was made. It's a great little window into the 50s. Number 2. Creature from the Black Lagoon. This is often considered the last of the classic Universal monsters, with the creature, the Gill-Man, always being grouped into that same monster family. It's shot in 3D with lots of great underwater scenes. It's beautiful to look at. Who's to say monster movies have to always be dark and gloomy? It does have its dark, creepy moments, but all the outdoor scenery is gorgeous. The Gill-Man suit is one of the best of its kind. He's a sympathetic creature. After all, they came into his home. His romantic attachment to a girl is similar to King Kong, but the film has a legacy of its own, with the main cast on a boat hunting a monster and a woman swimming with something watching her from underneath the water. It's clearly an inspiration for Jaws. And the number one Monster on the Loose film? Godzilla. There's probably no giant monster that has spawned more sequels and imitators than this. Even though it owes itself to Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, this is the one that started the whole genre of kaiju. The original Godzilla was very serious. He was a symbol of nuclear war from a country that firsthand experienced its devastating effects. But modern people today remember Godzilla for the cheesy moments that came later. This treats the monster as a terrifying disaster. This has to make number one. After all, he is the king of the monsters. And at last, top 5 scientific disasters. This is sort of a looser, miscellaneous category. There could be a monster in it, but not necessarily. The only requirement is that whatever the problem is, it has to be caused by some kind of scientific explanation. It could be a lab experiment gone wrong, or any kind of unnatural disaster. Number 5. The Tingler. Vincent Price plays a doctor who discovers that the spine-tingling feeling you get when you're scared is actually a creature growing in your back that feeds on your fear. The only thing that keeps it subdued is when you scream. But what if you didn't scream? He tries an experiment on a mute woman who can't scream by giving her an acid trip in a bizarre scene with some color effects. The rest of the film is black and white. And out of her back comes the Tingler. It's probably the greatest of the William Castle movies. This is the movie where he put buzzers in the theater seats to emulate the feeling of the Tingler, and there's a blackout moment where they encourage the audiences to scream. It would have been fun to see it in a theater back then, but it's still very enjoyable. It's cheesy in all the right ways. Number 4. Fiend Without a Face. A scientist conducts an experiment on brain power. He wants to find a way to move things with his mind, but ends up creating a living being out of pure thought. It's a bunch of invisible brains that suck people's blood and turn them into zombies. Wow. You never get to see the brains until the very end, when a nuclear overload makes them visible, but when you do see them, it's great. The brains crawl about with their spinal cord tails with a combination of stop motion and puppet work. The last scene is amazing, where a group of people are trapped in a house and fight the brains by shooting or stabbing them. And each time you see the blood bubbling out of the dead brains, and it lingers on it with the sound effects like... This is the only movie of the 50s where you can see a brain getting smashed with an axe. This must have been the goriest film of its time. How did this get released? Number 3. The Fly. Yes, there is an original The Fly, about a scientist who invents a teleportation unit but accidentally switches molecules with a fly. Everybody knows the Cronenberg remake from the 80s starring Jeff Goldblum, which was also great, but lots of people dismiss the original, which is very sad to me. The original is a true classic, but I can see why somebody would see the remake first, which is more in tune with modern sensibilities, and be spoiled by it, spoiled by the superior special effects, spoiled by Jeff Goldblum, and then go back to the original and not care for it. That's a shame. I was fortunate to have seen the original first, but I saw the remake almost immediately afterwards, and to me, seeing them both fresh back to back, I think the original tells the story best, without much special effects. Number 2. Forbidden Planet. Dr. Morbius, the last survivor of a scientific expedition to a distant planet, creates a machine that can materialize anything he can imagine, but he doesn't realize his subconscious mind creates an invisible monster that goes on a rampage, a projection of his evil inner self. This is one of the first movies to take place entirely on a planet other than Earth. It has one of the most famous robots of all time, Robbie. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you've seen that robot. This is in no way a cheesy B movie. This is top of the line. Big budget, color, widescreen, well-written, and very sophisticated. It's a masterpiece so influential to the sci-fi genre that you would have never had Star Trek without it. Not to mention, it stars Leslie Nielsen before he was famous for comedy. And number 1, The Incredible Shrinking Man. This is the only movie that can top all that. It's about a man who's exposed to a mysterious radiation at sea and slowly starts to shrink in size. It happens gradually throughout the course of the film, so you get the chance to know the character and care about what's happening to him. By the time he's tiny, every typical household thing is a danger to him, such as the cat and a spider. There were other movies made about tiny people before, like Dr. Cyclops, but this is the first one to turn a normal house into an adventure. It was clearly a big inspiration for Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. What makes the movie great is how tragic it feels. With no scientific cure for him, his situation just keeps getting worse and worse. It's an idea that could have been gimmicky, but it's so well executed. So check in next Tuesday. We'll finish up the Silver Age with the horror films of the 60s and Hammer.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. What the fuck Wednesday?
Terror Firmer. Oh man, it's one of the craziest movies I've ever seen in my life. It's from Trauma, and if you're familiar with Trauma, this is everything you'd expect. I think it's the movie that defines Trauma to me in a nutshell. Tons of nudity, tons of gore. A friend of mine showed it to me in college, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so insane I couldn't even watch it in one sitting. The first time that I actually sat down and watched the whole thing from beginning to end was sometime after college. This was when it made the biggest impact on me because I watched it with a group of friends, including Mike and Bootsy. From the moment it began all the way to the end, we were laughing. We laughed so hard I remember feeling dizzy. I should also explain that we watched another movie before that and we were not easily impressed. It was a small group and we were just looking for some crappy movie to laugh at. The first one we saw didn't do it for us, so then I suggested Terror Firmer because I remembered it being so crazy, and it surpassed everybody's expectations. After the movie was over, we all just sat there in silence, catching our breath. We didn't even know what to do after that. There's nothing I can say about the movie to do it justice. Many of the craziest parts I can't even show screenshots of. It's almost unreviewable. I could tell you this, it takes place on a movie set. Lloyd Kaufman plays the director, who happens to be blind and pisses 2 streams for some reason. There's a psycho killer going around the movie set dismembering people and mutilating them in all kinds of ways. During the opening credits, the killer pulls a man's leg off and beats him with it. Later, shoves a funnel into a guy's ass, pours cocaine into it, smashes a glass bong over his head, rips out his brain, and cooks it on a frying pan. A guy gets squashed in an escalator, who then finds a license plate in his body, like Jaws. A porta potty gets tipped over, rolling out a shit-covered man. One of the characters does CPR on him, and there's a slight running gag that his character likes the taste of shit. There's a naked man running through New York City, which was clearly done for real. There's a guy who gets his dick yanked out halfway across the room. Somebody gets lit on fire with a fart bomb. None of the characters are normal. Everybody's batshit insane. It's a total madhouse. Also, half the characters are wearing shirts with profanity on them. The whole movie is covered in obscenity, visual, verbal, and written. It hits you like a bomb. So if you're in that kind of mood and you're looking for something really wild, check it out.
Bloodthirsty Thursday.
The Lost Boys, directed by Joel Schumacher, stars a plethora of young actors such as Corey Feldman and Corey Haim. It's about a single mom and her two sons, Michael and Sam, who move into a North California town. The boys meet a couple of young comic book clerks who are obsessed with vampires, but these guys are actually real vampire hunters. Then Michael ends up hanging out with some real vampires and gets turned into one of them. Sam points out to him that his reflection in the mirror is fading and says one of the greatest lines, "You're a vampire, wait till I tell Mom." So they turn to the vampire hunting comic book kids for help, who say that either Sam needs to kill his brother or kill the head vampire that turned him into one. There's some great funny moments, like when Sam goes to bed wearing a wreath of garlic around his neck. Also, the part when they go into a church right when a baby is about to be baptized. They quickly run in and fill a container with holy water, and everyone stares at them. Corey Feldman talks in this tough guy voice the whole time, and I thought it was too offbeat when I first saw this, but that voice has grown on me, and now I think it's really funny. To describe the film in general, I would say it has sort of a coming-of-age feel. It has kids moving to new places, finding new social circles, finding which groups they fit into, and it has a visual style that's sort of like Peter Pan meets MTV. Any film that uses young actors where they all do a good job and where the script takes itself seriously, but not too seriously, is something that always wins you over. Everybody is likable, except for the mom's new boyfriend, but there's a reason for that. The characters you're supposed to love, you love. The characters you're supposed to hate, you hate. It pokes fun at the vampire lore, but not in a way that ever feels too forced. The kids do all kinds of things, such as filling a bathtub with holy water. It's funny in a cute kind of way, but also works as a legit vampire film. There's lots of other 80s horror comedies that have that cult appeal. Fright Night, Monster Squad, Night of the Creeps. These movies have the right level of obscurity where they're not too mainstream, but enough people remember them and are attached to them as being part of our generation. I do give Lost Boys my endorsement. Of course, I want to be part of the club, but I think it's a more minor entry to a very long list of 80s cult classics.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Franken Friday.
In the 90s, after all the new faces of horror like Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger all had their run, it was time to bring back the classics. This is when producer-director Francis Ford Coppola gave us a double package, Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was an attempt to more faithfully bring the pages of the novels to the screen, although they both invented a lot of wacky stuff. I already reviewed Bram Stoker's Dracula a couple years back. You can't do one without the other, so here it is, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Coppola produced, but this time the directing duties were turned over to Kenneth Branagh, who also stars in the film as Victor Frankenstein. Also, executive producer Fred Fuchs is back. Good old Fred Fox. Frank Darabont wrote the script, and supposedly he hated the final result. He said it was the best script he ever wrote, but the worst movie he ever saw. The question is, what would Mary Shelley think? If you're going to put the author's name on it, you better stick damn close to it. There's no way they can come back and tell you if they'd agree or not. Yes, for the most part, it does follow the book pretty closely, but there are some major differences. The biggest one I'll get to. The plot. I don't think I need to explain. It's Frankenstein, okay? It pays some tribute to the classic 1931 version, more proof how that movie is so famous that even when they're trying to stick to the book, they can't ignore it. For example, Frankenstein has to find a brain for his creation, just like the scene in the original where Fritz has to steal a brain from a science class. Also, they use the famous line, "It's alive," which originated in the classic film. The creation scene is interesting. Every film version has to make up its own because in the novel, the way in which Frankenstein actually makes the monster is kept vague. Here, he's running shirtless through the lab as the camera is whipping all over the place. He's using electric eels. There's a giant scrotum on the ceiling. I don't know what's going on. The makeup on the monster is good. He looks like somebody who's really been stitched together. In the close-ups, you can see both his eyes are different colors, as if they've been taken from two different people. I thought that was interesting. The monster, of course, is played by Robert De Niro. Might seem like an odd casting choice, but he did a good job. He probably has some of the most subtle acting in the whole film, when everyone else is so stagey and over the top, including Branagh. Of course, he does have his big moments, like that scene that was in the trailers and commercials when he's standing in front of the burning house and he turns to face the camera and says, "I will have my revenge, Frankenstein!" Speaking of revenge, I never really bought it. Sure, Frankenstein does not think of his consequences. He takes no responsibility after creating the monster, but the way it plays off, it's not like he really abandoned the monster. It seems more like he thought the monster was dead. It just doesn't seem like a strong enough rejection for the monster to actually comprehend that and then instantly want revenge. Sometimes the monster is really sympathetic, the way he should be, but then he's ripping out fucking hearts. There's a part where he's sitting with Frankenstein in a cave of ice and they're having a civilized conversation, and the monster tells Frankenstein how he killed his brother. It's very blunt. He just says, "I picked him up and crushed his throat," and he's being so mean about it, and Frankenstein, who's been so melodramatic the rest of the film, just sits there and takes it, and then they carry on having a normal conversation. This was a chance for De Niro to have the role of a lifetime, but his talents were harmed by a tonally inconsistent script. At the same time, I just wish they cast somebody lesser known because De Niro is such a high-profile actor and so recognizable. Anyway, the biggest difference from the novel, at least the biggest difference that stuck out to me, in the novel, Frankenstein creates a bride for the monster, but right before he gives it life, he changes his mind and destroys it. In this one, after the monster kills Frankenstein's wife, this time by ripping her heart out like a Mortal Kombat fatality, Frankenstein goes crazy, carries her corpse to his lab, and reanimates her. So this film not only draws from the classic, it draws from Frankenhooker. He even has to use her head on a different body, just like in Frankenhooker. When he brings her back to life, she looks horrible. There's parts of her head missing, one eye is kind of stitched over, then he starts dancing with her. She's laying limp in his arms as he spins her around, and her head just keeps leaning over as if it's barely attached, but Frankenstein is so helplessly optimistic about it, he keeps begging her to say his name. It makes Frankenstein out to be really sad and pathetic, which I think could have been a great direction if the rest of the film was more consistent. Then the monster shows up and wants the bride for himself, and the two of them literally tug a war over her. I almost thought the stitches were going to come apart and she'd rip in two. That would be one hell of an ending, like a Looney Tunes finale. Then she runs from them both, and without any words, by doing this, she expresses everything you need to know right before lighting herself on fire and committing suicide. It's a very disturbing scene, so disturbing to me, it's the highlight. After 20 years, still, that's the best part that I remember, and it has nothing to do with the book. Sometimes movies are best when they make up their own stuff, because books and movies are two totally different mediums. I just don't think they should have called it Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm not exactly sure what this movie is trying to be. I feel very mixed about it. I'm one of few people who remembers the made-for-TV version of Frankenstein that predated the Branagh version. It aired on TNT on June 13th, 1993, and was later released on VHS. It had a much lower budget, and for the budget, I think they did a better job. It's a shame this one is so overlooked. This one also tried very hard to emulate Mary Shelley, and I think it's debatable which one got it right.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Joe Dante, the director of The Howling and Gremlins, was a big fan of monster movies. It's no wonder that his films always pay tribute to the classics. With Matinee from 1993, he goes full tribute with a film about the movie-going experience. It's set in 1962 and centers around a group of kids who are going to the theater to see a monster movie called Mant. Half man, half ant, all terror. John Goodman plays a movie director named Lawrence Woolsey who is based on the real-life William Castle. It could have almost been a biographical film, but they went the fictional route. Woolsey is a big showman, making an in-person appearance at the screening of his new film presented in Atomovision and Rumble-Rama. Just like Castle, he plants all kinds of gags in the theater. Buzzers in the seats and a man running through the crowd in an ant costume are only some of the tricks up his sleeve. Gene is a teenage movie fan. He's always reading monster magazines, his bedroom wall has all the good posters, and of course he looks up to Woolsey. Gene's father is in the Navy aboard a submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This creates a somber tone in contrast with the cheesy monster movie. The film attracts protesters for its inappropriate timing during a national crisis, but Woolsey insists that people need the escapism. One of the protesters is played by Dick Miller. Always great to see him. There's a subplot with Gene's friend Stan, who brings a girl to the movie, but her jealous ex-boyfriend happens to be the guy playing the ant, so he flips out. There's a lot going on, and in the big finale, the whole theater starts falling apart. It's the only part of this movie that I don't like. I think it's too over the top, while the rest of the movie is mostly grounded in reality. I always love films that have a movie inside a movie. There aren't enough of this kind. Even the general public in 1993 didn't really seem to catch on to this. It's great when we get to see a historical recreation of the movies of the past through a fan's eyes who was actually there to experience it for himself. It only makes sense that decades later there was an emergence of monster movies inspired by the 50s and 60s because so many directors like Joe Dante were now grown up and making their own movies. In the 80s, there were remakes of The Thing, The Fly, The Blob, even Invaders from Mars. So every generation seems to borrow something from the last. Matinee is more than just a tribute. It's a very charming coming-of-age story and a great window to the past. Thanks to Joe Dante for sharing.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Fritz Lang's Metropolis is one of the great shining gems from the silent era. With its German expressionist art style, it's captured the imagination of filmmakers everywhere, including George Lucas. Where do you think the basic idea of C-3PO came from? From the robot in Metropolis. How about the futuristic city of Blade Runner? Metropolis. A girl being stalked in a dark hallway? Metropolis. A mad scientist in a lab full of electrical gadgets zapping life into a creation? Metropolis. A hero trying to rescue the girl on top of a building? Metropolis, or Caligari. It inspired lots of immediate films like Frankenstein and King Kong, but still to this day, it has a strong influence. Most of the sci-fi and fantasy that we know stems from it in some way, especially whenever you're talking about a vision of the future. Metropolis was the first to do it with such an epic scope. The shots of the city are amazing to look at. They were all done with miniatures. It has a modern look, but also some Gothic elements, with the main building rising like a cathedral. While the film looks ahead into the future, it also looks to the past. It attempts to retell many old stories and ideas, such as the 7 deadly sins, the Whore of Babylon, and most importantly, the Tower of Babel, which it uses to illustrate the miscommunication between the underground workers in the city and the elite group above who are in charge of it all. That's the main theme, that the workers who keep the city running are forgotten. They live down under like rats, while the people above live like royalty. The quote that it keeps repeating is the mediator between the brain and the hands must be the heart, meaning somebody needs to bridge the gap between these two groups and get them to work better together, because with no communication, it can all fall apart. The film tries to do a lot. It has all kinds of themes running all over the place, very ambitious for its time. The plot can be a little confusing, but a lot of that is because many scenes have been lost. The film has had a complicated history. When it was first released, it was over 2.5 hours long. Afterwards, there were many different versions that were cut to shorter lengths. Then it slipped into public domain. Because of this, during the home video age, it was released over and over again by everybody using the only surviving version, which looked like shit. This is how I first saw it, and then over the years it's been partially restored again and again, each time improving the image quality and adding more newly discovered scenes. Then a funny thing happened. Usually when a work enters the public domain, it's public domain forever. But new laws somehow brought this film out of the public domain. Even though everybody who worked on it is dead, the copyright now belongs to the Murnau Foundation. The good part of that is that now there's authorized versions being released that are more complete and look beautiful. The latest edition on Blu-ray is magnificent, but there's still important scenes missing. They have script notes that appear on screen to tell you what's supposed to be happening. So whenever they call it the complete Metropolis, that's not accurate. Bottom line, if you're into classic science fiction, Metropolis is mandatory.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Modern Monday.
Oculus. How do I explain this one without making it sound stupid? It's about a killer mirror. Yeah, but it happens to be one of the most original and cerebral horror films to come out in recent years. The story is told in a non-linear fashion, very much like a Christopher Nolan movie. It constantly jumps between the past and the present until the two time periods become intertwined. It centers around a brother and sister, Tim and Kaylee, who had an awful experience in their childhood where their dad murdered their mom and Tim was forced into murdering the father, presumably. They believe their dad was influenced by a supernatural power caused by an antique mirror that they recently acquired. Tim is sent to a mental institution and goes under intensive therapy. Then 11 years go by, he's released from the institution and reunites with his sister. He's feeling fine, but Kaylee instantly brings him back into their world of trauma. She's still convinced it was the mirror that ruined their lives, citing a whole history of owners who have died because of it, and now she wants her revenge, reacquiring the mirror from an auction house with the intent of destroying it forever. The siblings each have their own side of the story. Tim doesn't believe in the supernatural elements, but Kaylee thinks the institution brainwashed him all those years. She seems like the crazy one, filling a room with cameras, computers, alarm clocks, thermometers, and lights with battery backups, all to prove the mirror has evil powers, and to kill it with some kind of anchor weight contraption. But soon, Tim starts to believe it, just as we do as an audience. In one of the most chilling moments in modern horror history, they come back into the room to find everything has moved. Normally, I would say that's a very stock cliche for ghost movies, and I never found it frightening. But then, they look at the video evidence to see a replay of the dialogue they just had, but while they're talking, they're moving the objects. So they did it themselves without knowing. This scene gave me goosebumps. It's true that in life, most of the things you do, you probably don't remember accurately. That's a thought that always disturbs me. What's real and what isn't? But here, the characters can't even remember what happened minutes ago. Is their perception of reality being distorted by the mirror? What's happening? It hooks you in and takes you on a whirlwind. We see them as children and as adults. It keeps cutting back and forth between the two timelines until they're so closely connected that sometimes the child actors appear in the same shots as the adult actors. It gives you a feeling of disorientation that keeps on accelerating. It can be viewed as a supernatural story or a psychological drama about two siblings who share delusions caused by a traumatic past. All the acting is convincing, especially Karen Gillan, who's been in Doctor Who. She is great, 100% believable. This is the kind of movie that you may want to see multiple times. It's always great for a discussion.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Top 10 Tuesday.
Here's part 2 of the Silver Age. As I've said before, my idea of the Silver Age of horror is two distinct movements. The 50s, which leaned more towards science fiction, and the 60s, which leaned more towards horror. They overlap a bit because in the late 50s, that's when Hammer started remaking all the classics and bringing traditional horror back, but now in color, ramping up the sex and violence. But parallel to Hammer, you had all kinds of different horror films, each with their own fresh ideas. I don't want to bog down the whole list with Hammer, and because it overlaps with the 50s, it makes the criteria confusing. So I'm going to, again, split this in two, a top 5 for Hammer and a top 10 for 60s horror. Here we go. Top 5 Hammer films. Number 5. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. It's 5th in the Frankenstein series. It's a very uneven film, far from perfect, but when it's good, it's really good. Here Frankenstein's trying to do a brain transplant. Not that interesting compared to his earlier efforts, but if you want to see Peter Cushing at his most sinister, this is it. Never has Frankenstein been so evil. Number 4. Dracula Has Risen from His Grave. It's 3rd in the Dracula series. For all the sequels, it's a tough pick because they each contain something I like. I almost picked Dracula Prince of Darkness, but the reason this one stands out for me is the main hero, Paul. They're all named Paul. He's not a knowledge vampire hunter, he's just a regular guy, and it was an interesting idea to make him an atheist, so all the common vampire traditions like using the cross or saying the prayers, it all makes it harder for him to fight Dracula. Number 3. Horror of Dracula. The first of the Hammer Draculas. This is the one that made Christopher Lee the new Dracula for a modern era, second only to Lugosi. And Peter Cushing as Van Helsing has got to be the most classic vampire hunter of them all. Great atmosphere, great look, handles the source material well. In many ways, it feels like Bram Stoker's novel come to life, even though it excludes many things like Renfield. Number 2. The Mummy. By far the best version of The Mummy since the original Karloff version. Here we have Christopher Lee as the mummy Karras and Peter Cushing as the son of the archaeologist who broke into the tomb. As revenge, a modern-day Egyptian priest is using the mummy to kill off everybody involved, including the descendants. There's a great scene where Cushing and the priest have a face-off. The priest says it was wrong to desecrate their tomb because it was sacred, while Cushing says that he's only trying to preserve their ancient history or else it'll be forgotten. You get a sense that both sides believe they're right. No clear good or bad, although a killer mummy definitely leans toward bad. And the number 1 Hammer film? Curse of Frankenstein. It's the first Gothic Hammer film of them all, and the first to star Cushing and Lee. Here, Frankenstein, played by Cushing, is so committed to his work that he sacrifices human lives in the process. He doesn't care what it takes. He justifies it all in the name of science. He's totally believable as a scientist who's gone too far. The creature, played by Lee, is totally different than the Universal version, which was different than the novel. So it's always a retelling, and this is just that, a great retelling of a classic story. Now, on to the top horror films of the 60s. This time we're sticking strictly to the decade of the 60s and finishing out the Silver Age. I have to give some honorable mentions to Repulsion, Village of the Damned, and all the Mario Bava films like Black Sunday and Blood and Black Lace. I should also mention Rosemary's Baby, even though I'm not a big fan of that one. I just don't see what the big deal is, why it's so highly regarded, but still can't forget it. Number 10. The Birds from Alfred Hitchcock. It's far from perfect, but it can't be ignored as being one of the first films to push the idea of nature attacking. The birds are clearly revolting against humanity for no explicit reason. The way it deals with suspense was very important for the genre. Number 9. Peeping Tom. The film pioneered the use of the POV camera where we see through the killer's eyes as he follows people around. Here it's literally the camera recording it all because the killer is making a movie of his murders. Unlike the later slasher villains that would always be masked or hidden in secret, this guy, we actually see him and get to know him, and clearly he's a very disturbed individual. Number 8. The Last Man on Earth. It's based on the novel I Am Legend. Vincent Price fights to survive in a zombie apocalypse, but the zombies also happen to be vampires too. This is one of the first survival horror films, predating Night of the Living Dead. Number 7. Black Sabbath from Mario Bava, not to be confused with Black Sunday. Here we have a trilogy of horror stories. The original Italian version was called Three Faces of Fear, and there's many differences between the two, mainly the order of the stories. One of them stars Boris Karloff and is the most visually appealing of them all. There's also one about a woman who receives mysterious, threatening phone calls from a stranger, one of the first of the phone genre, if you will. And then there's one about a woman who steals a ring from a corpse, which I find to be the most disturbing because of the corpse's weird death face. Number 6. House of Usher by Roger Corman. This was his breakthrough film, in glorious color with rich, creepy atmosphere. Stretching any simple Edgar Allan Poe story into a film can be tricky, but this does a great job keeping a surreal, nightmarish tone. With Vincent Price, you can't go wrong. Number 5. The Haunting. I don't find ghosts to be scary, but still, this classic haunted house movie from Robert Wise is spectacular to look at. In widescreen black and white with creepy camera angles and spooky set design, the house itself is like the main character of the film. They really make this house out to be foreboding and sinister. Number 4. Carnival of Souls. This is a low-budget independent film, but the shoddiness of it only enhances the eerie vibe. A woman finds herself mysteriously drawn to an old abandoned amusement park. They use a real abandoned place. Unlike lots of horror films that use fake sets, this gives it a feeling of realism, but also maintains a weird, artificial, dreamlike feel. And that strange organ music, you can't forget. Number 3. At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul. Badass. Jose Mojica Marins, also known as Coffin Joe, is the villain here. He's one of the most cruel, ruthless horror villains ever, torturing women with spiders and stabbing people in the face. It's brutal, but not so much by explicit violence, but how mean he is in his dialogue. Even though it's some hardcore horror for its time, it still has a classic atmospheric look. Also, check out the sequel, This Night I Possess Your Corpse, for one of the most outrageous depictions of hell. Number 2. Psycho from Hitchcock. It's possibly still the best example of the human monster. Norman Bates seems like such a nice normal guy, but has deep-rooted issues that are so complex a psychologist has to explain it all in the last scene because the whole concept was so far ahead of its time. Anthony Perkins is amazing, and the star, Janet Leigh, well, not so much the star. Hitchcock didn't want to allow audience members to show up late to the movie because they'd be wondering, what happened to her? This film broke all the rules. And the number 1 60s horror film, Night of the Living Dead from George Romero and Company. This is the last black and white horror film of its kind. It owes much to the classics, but shocked people with its mild, suggestive gore, and the MPAA rating system went into effect that same year. The whole movie-going landscape had changed. This is the movie that introduced the idea of flesh-eating zombies that need to be shot in the head. It was a study of the survival behavior of human beings and their inability to work with one another to overcome a supernatural disaster. It's simply a milestone. So tune in next time. Next Tuesday, we go into the Bronze Age.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. What the fuck Wednesday?
House. Wow. Just see the movie. I can't believe what I saw. Even after seeing it a second time, I still can't believe it. And I need to see it again because I don't know how I'm going to review it. So don't consider this a review. Consider it more like an awareness. This is an easy film to miss because of its generic title, House. For years, people have recommended it to me, and I must have thought they were talking about House from 1986. There's also a film called House from 2008. And they're all horror films. If you look for this, make sure it's the one from 1977, from Toho. Yes, the company that created Godzilla. But this makes even the weirdest ones like Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster seem normal. If I describe the plot, even then it sounds generic. It's about a group of girls who go on a trip and stay at a house, which turns out to be haunted. Sort of. It doesn't sound like anything special, but this is as special as it gets. It's not even a full horror film. There's horror scenes, but the majority is sort of a mixed genre of all kinds of different tones. The film changes mood at the flick of a switch. It's all over the place. 1 minute it's lighthearted and cute, then there's blood, severed limbs, and weird lightning effects. There's a decapitated head biting a girl on the rear end. There's a girl who gets eaten by a piano. There's a skeleton dancing around by strings. A glowing cat jumping out of a painting. Blood spurts, heads float, but somehow it keeps going back to that cute, childish tone. Supposedly, the director asked his preteen daughter what she thought would be scary, so some of the ideas actually come from a child, and it's appropriate because it looks like a nightmare from a child's perspective. On the technical side, this is an incredibly ambitious film for 1977. It's crazy how many different camera tricks they use. There's backdrop paintings, blue screen, animation, and sometimes what looks like cutout animation. It's like a moving magazine collage. It uses almost every kind of special effect that there is. The backdrop paintings especially look beautiful. It's so well made, you'd wonder, why isn't this a well-known classic, other than for the reason that it's so offbeat? Well, apparently it was a box office hit when it came out in Japan, but the critical reviews were negative, and afterwards it got kind of swept under the rug. Only in recent years was it rediscovered and released on DVD by the Criterion Collection, which typically puts out films that are considered masterpieces, like the Kurosawa films, so it's more confirmation that this is a very noteworthy film. I do have to say, lots of it is very slow. In the first half hour, there's not much exciting happening, and all the really crazy parts mostly happen after the 1 hour mark, so you might find large portions of it to be boring, but I say, stick with it. It's a shame that it's called House and not something that will catch your attention better. This is a film that when you see it, you'll wonder, why haven't you seen it earlier?
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Bloodthirsty Thursday.
I've already reviewed all the classic Universal monster films, at least all the major ones, so now I'd like to talk about one that never got made. I think talking about non-existing films can sometimes be just as interesting. After Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943, Universal saw the potential of their own cinematic universe, so they hired Bernard Schubert to write a script for a follow-up called The Wolfman vs. Dracula. If that was the real title, it could have been the first film with verses in the title. Schubert also wrote Mark the Vampire and The Mummy's Curse. Some people think it was The Mummy's Ghost, but it wasn't. Obviously, the movie was never made and the script was lost until decades later. It was found in a box in his garage, supposedly, and it's been published by Philip J. Riley, who not only released this, but a whole series of books dedicated to classic monster scripts that were never made into films. It's strange that there seem to be no other sources. There's little to no information about it anywhere except for this right here. So some people say it's a hoax, but I believe it's real. Obviously the poster is fake. They took the images from other posters, but the script has to be real. You know why? Dracula and the Wolfman never fight. If this was fan fiction, nobody today would call it Wolfman versus Dracula without having the Wolfman fight Dracula. Technically, they do fight, sort of, but the Wolfman is in human form and Dracula is in bat form, a giant bat. I guess Larry Talbot versus the giant Dracula bat didn't have as good a ring. This is the kind of shit they would pull back in the 40s. It's very much in tune with some of the other movies. They always had a problem with juggling multiple monsters. For example, in House of Frankenstein, Dracula appears in the first act, then is quickly destroyed by sunlight before the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster appear. But the focus is on the Wolfman while the monster lays dormant in the lab, and right after the Wolfman's killed by a silver bullet, the monster finally rises in the last few minutes. That's the kind of thing they do here. Larry and Dracula interact a lot, but only after Dracula is destroyed does Larry finally become the Wolfman at the very end. At least that's the first time you see him as the Wolfman on screen. He does become the wolf in the beginning, but you only see his shadow. His shadow, how would I know that? Well, the script is very specific about the camera angles. Nowadays, you don't do that. At least that's how I was taught. You're supposed to let the director decide on the camera angles. Although if the writer is creative enough, the screenplay can suggest camera angles by how it's worded. But this script is all over the place with close-up, wide shot, and so on. That clues me in that this was genuinely from the 40s. Not to mention, it's written very sloppily, like this was the first draft before Universal pulled the plug. There's actually some parts where the wrong character is speaking, and it's real confusing. It was meant to be shot in Technicolor, which is hard for me to imagine. I picture this in black and white, but that's not the first time Universal tried to do something in color. They were going to do it for Son of Frankenstein, but they did a makeup test of Karloff in color, and for whatever reason decided it wasn't the right choice, so they went with traditional black and white. The 1943 version of Phantom of the Opera ended up being in color, so maybe they allocated the budget towards that, rather than Wolfman vs. Dracula, which would have been made that same year or shortly after. Lots of the script refers to stock footage. Anytime there's a shot of the castle or a full moon or anything they already shot for another film, they were planning to recycle that. But all that footage was black and white, so were they planning to colorize it somehow or maybe just tint it? For casting, supposedly they were considering Bela Lugosi as Dracula. This would have been his first comeback to the character. They had already done Son of Dracula, which starred Lon Chaney Jr. as Dracula. Nowhere in the movie do they refer to him as the son. The title is wrong, so he is Dracula. But anyway, Chaney was the major monster player of this time. But for Wolfman vs. Dracula, he couldn't play Dracula because he was the Wolfman. In Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, what'd they do? Cast Lugosi as the monster. This time was no different. I can confirm this because, according to the would-be cinematographer, when he was interviewed by Philip Riley, he said Dracula and Larry Talbot would have looked like the same person, so they chose Lugosi. That's the reason to cast Lugosi? How about because he's Dracula? He's the best and always will be. Now let's get to the plot. It begins with Larry's corpse being discovered with a silver bullet in his heart, and lying next to him is the skeleton of a woman. It's no sequel to Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. It doesn't follow any continuity, but strangely, this seems to pick up right after House of Frankenstein, which wasn't even made yet. So maybe this is where they got that idea for House of Frankenstein. Anyway, a doctor ends up removing the bullet from his heart, and this brings him back to life. So the bullet only kept his heart from beating and put him in a state of suspended animation. That's why his body didn't decay like the girl's. That type of logic is what you'd expect from these movies. So now Larry's up and about, and he briefly becomes a wolf in shadow, as I mentioned. Now he's looking to die again to end his curse. Another bit of logic that's quite necessary is they explain why Larry can't just shoot himself with a silver bullet. You'd think he could just do it and be done with it, but here they address that he can only be killed when he's in wolf form. And when he's in wolf form, that's the only time when he doesn't want to die. So he goes to a hangman named Anatol, I guess thinking that since Anatol's job is to execute people, maybe he wouldn't mind. Well, of course, Anatol thinks he's crazy like the rest, but it just so happens Dracula is trying to marry his daughter, Yvonne. But now Larry falls in love with her, so there's this love triangle going on. That's the basic setup. After that, the plot takes many twists and turns. Larry ends up marrying Yvonne and then begins wishing to stay alive, looking for a cure rather than death. There's also some weird thing about Dracula being a doctor and trying to cure Larry just to trick him away from Yvonne. They totally missed an opportunity to call him Dr. Acula. They needed Ed Wood. Also, Dracula is always turning into a wolf. Yes, Dracula is a wolf more often than the Wolfman. Now here's the really confusing part. Dracula turns into a wolf and kills somebody, and Larry gets the blame. That would have been an interesting idea for Dracula to frame Larry so that everybody blames the wrong wolf, but instead they treat it as if it was a human murder. So the fact that Dracula was a wolf wasn't even important at all. I really thought they were going to do something interesting there. Everyone believes Larry is a murderer, but they don't believe he's a werewolf. It's hilarious how far it can go before somebody figures out what we all know. At the end, Larry stabs Dracula with a crucifix while he's in bat form. Then he becomes the Wolfman, goes on a little rampage, then Anatol shoots him with the silver bullet, and that's the basic rundown. It's a sloppy mess, but that's what a lot of these movies were like. So I can really imagine this as one of those. It has the graveyard, the castle, all the things you'd expect. When I read this, I could clearly see it in my mind, as if I was watching a Universal monster film that I've never seen. Even though it was never made, it seems as if it had an influence. Return of the Vampire came out in 1944, featuring both a werewolf and a vampire, played by Bela Lugosi. The silver bullet idea ended up being used in House of Frankenstein. Dracula ended up being included with the rest of the monster mashes. Larry began looking for a cure instead of death in House of Dracula, and the Wolfman and Dracula actually did end up fighting in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So it's possible that this script is where it all sprang from.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness Franken Friday.
I'm aiming real low today. This is bottom of the barrel. Frankenstein meets the space monster from 1965. A Martian princess invades Earth with her sidekick, Dr. Nadir. The first thing that comes to mind is that he clearly looks like Fester from the Addams Family, except with Spock ears. He's played by Lou Cattell, who has appeared in some TV shows like Seinfeld and had a brief appearance in Pee-wee's Big Adventure as Amazing Larry. Also, another fun fact, one of the Martian assistants is played by Bruce Glover, who's Crispin Glover's father, who's also in the James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever. The Martians are from a dying race, so their master plan is to kidnap Earth's women to breed with them, mainly focusing on swimsuit models, of course. Meanwhile, NASA is trying to send an astronaut far out into space who happens to be an android. Yeah, and in one of the most hilarious, awkward moments, he's in a meeting with his superiors, and one of them asks him if he's the best for the job, how come he's never heard of him? He replies, well, I'm just shy, and then he gives this awkward grin, and then the film freezes on the grin for a long period of time. You can still see the film scratches moving, so you know it's not a problem with your internet connection or your DVD player. Then you see everyone in the room reacting to it and realize that he's an android and he's glitching up. Well, they repair him and send him up in the rocket, but the Martians think it's a weapon, so they blow it up. Now half his face is burned off, and there you go. There's your Frankenstein. Now he's on the loose killing people for no real reason, but the scientists find him and manage to turn him from killer to hero. In the final act, he storms the alien ship, rescuing the girls, equipped with a laser gun, but guess the aliens have a hairy, skull-faced Martian monster that's been in a cage for most of the movie, but now, in the last 5 minutes, fights the android in a gray, hazy, washed-out void as if it was filmed inside a sauna. You can hardly see anything. The budget was so low that half the film is made up of stock footage. We're constantly cutting to army vehicles, soldiers, and planes taking off. Not even Ed Wood used this much stock footage. Also, there's tons of music interludes. Sometimes it's people dancing or it's just people on a motorcycle, but it's always music, rock and roll music. That definitely makes the film obvious as a product of its time, but that also makes it a little more fun. There's some brief scenes where people are talking, but their voices are muted with only music as the soundtrack, as if they lost the audio or something. One of my favorite parts, to simulate the shaking motion of the spaceship, the actors are obviously wobbling in their chairs like this. All these flaws, from the cheesy costumes, the makeup, the set design, and the acting, only make it more appealing. You gotta love it. There's a great quote that I read inside the DVD booklet. According to one of the writers, it opened at an international science fiction festival. It bombed out there, and it has been bombing out in theaters and on late-night television ever since. It just keeps on bombing on and on, like nobody can stop the damn thing.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
When it comes to monsters, the original Clash of the Titans from 1981 has some of the best monsters of all. Best of the beasts. You have a two-headed wolf, giant scorpions, the Medusa, the Kraken, and more. It's loosely based on a combination of stories from Greek mythology. It's one of the greatest heroic adventure flicks, the epitome of the magical fantasy swords and sorcery genre. They should have made a video game about it. All the monsters are stop motion, and that's the main appeal. It was the last feature film to have effects done by the legendary Ray Harryhausen. Afterwards, he retired. Even back in '81, stop motion was beginning to fade away. Keep in mind, Empire Strikes Back was out, so this may be the last true relic of a bygone age. This shows an absolute perfection of the craft, especially the Medusa scene. The whole scene is lit with torches, which reflects on Medusa's body, so every frame of animation the light had to be flickering. It creates a hellish appearance, making Medusa scarier. As a kid, this movie scared the shit out of me. I can't even count how many moments that made me cover my eyes. The plot, like I said, is a combination of stories. The opening scene is about the god Zeus acting out his revenge against the king of Argos, using the Kraken as his weapon of mass destruction. The reason for the revenge is that the king sent Zeus's mortal lover Danae and their demigod son Perseus into the sea in a wooden chest, which is a whole story in itself. The point is, when Zeus gets that mad, he says, "Let loose the Kraken." So the Kraken destroys the city and everyone dies, and that's the beginning of the movie. Next, Zeus takes out his anger on Calibos because he hunted and killed all of his flying horses, so he turns him into a monstrous deformity. Calibos was going to marry the Princess Andromeda, but now that he's so hideous, the marriage is basically off. But Calibos' mother is the goddess Thetis, and she helps him out by casting some kind of curse on Andromeda so that her soul sleepwalks out of her body into a cage held by a giant vulture that carries her to Calibos' swampy lair to be given a riddle to ask all her potential suitors in marriage, and if they answer wrong, which they always do, they burn at the stake. Okay, this is not the kind of plot that can be summarized easily. Basically, this whole middle story is about Perseus, now grown up, trying to save Andromeda from Calibos while hanging out with Burgess Meredith and riding a winged horse named Pegasus, who became the TriStar logo. The gods give him some power-ups on the way: a sword, a shield, a helmet that makes him invisible, and a fucking metal owl named Bulbul. Actually, Bulbul comes after Perseus defeats Calibos, so he saves the day and is about to marry Andromeda. With any movie, that would normally sound like the ending. But no, now the real movie starts. Queen Cassiopeia has to comment that Andromeda is more beautiful than the goddess Thetis. She's already pissed off that they chopped off her son's hand, but now this takes it a step too far. She orders that Andromeda be sacrificed to the Kraken in 30 days, so this begins Perseus' final quest to defeat the Kraken and save Andromeda once again. His journey brings him to the Grey Ones, 3 old blind witches who share an eye, and are sisters of the Gorgons, who are sisters of Medusa. He gets them to tell him the only way to kill the Kraken is with Medusa's head, because her gaze, even after death, will turn any living being into stone. So his journey takes him to Medusa's lair, where he has to sever her head, fight a bunch of scorpions and shit, and finally face the Kraken. He wins. The end. Whew. The reason I went into such plot detail is to bring up an interesting point. I saw the remake recently, and of course I had no desire to see the remake. I mean, come on, Clash of the Titans without stop motion? But I gave it a chance, and you know what? It's not great, but the way they reworked the plot I thought was interesting. They managed to consolidate the overlapping stories so it had a more linear feel. For example, they made the King of Argos and Calibos the same person. That cuts down a lot of time having to explain why Zeus is angry at 2 different people, and Andromeda having to be sacrificed to the Kraken is set up much earlier on, so the whole adventure is based on that instead of all that riddle shit. It's not often when a remake helps me to notice how something in the original could have been improved, but still, you can't beat the charm of the original. Also, gotta mention, Bulbul makes a cameo in the remake, and it's the same Bulbul. With all these plot differences, you might wonder, what about the original Greek stories? Why not just stick to the source material? Well, the thing is, with Greek mythology, the stories don't always translate perfectly to the screen, and they've been retold so many times that they always tend to have slight differences. Sometimes there's no clear original source. In this movie, they invented a lot. Medusa and the Kraken are now titans, which they never were. The Kraken isn't even from Greek mythology, and it's a giant squid. Also, Charon, the skeleton ferryman who takes Perseus and his gang across the river, was usually depicted as a bearded old man, although the skeleton is much more cool. Also, he's supposed to be carrying dead people across the river Styx to Hades, the underworld, not the Medusa's lair. The 2-headed dog, if it was meant to be Cerberus, it should have been guarding the gate to Hades, not Medusa. Not to mention, it should have had 3 heads, but I guess that's 1 less head for Harryhausen to animate, so who can blame him? Perseus usually gets around on sandals with wings, not the horse Pegasus. Also, Pegasus was originally supposed to be born out of Medusa's blood, which they sort of allude to. After Perseus throws the head of Medusa into the sea, Pegasus immediately flies out of the water. Just a little nod. As for Calibos and Bulbul, both inventions of the film. Harryhausen said that legends are always retold, so what they were trying to do was combine the best elements that would make the best scenes, sort of like the best of Greek mythology. The short answer is, it's a movie. And a fantastic one. How many good movies can you name from Greek mythology, more specifically that involve Greek monsters? Clash of the Titans and Jason and the Argonauts. Done.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Targets is a very significant horror film for many reasons which I'll explain, but the first reason is that it was one of the last films to star Boris Karloff. It goes without saying, he was one of the kings of horror. He was acting in horror films from the beginning of the 30s to the end of the 60s, and even after he died, films that he previously shot were still being released into the early 70s, with Snake People being the final one. But ignoring those others, Targets is his swan song, the last true Boris Karloff film. It seems as if it was purposely made to be his final farewell to the horror business. The others were just crappy leftovers. Karloff's character, Byron Orlock, is an aging horror star who's ready to retire. So basically, he's playing himself. They even use film clips from Criminal Code and The Terror, which blurs the line between the real person and the character. But the main difference is that the character, Orlock, is bitter and resentful about the movie industry. Nothing impresses him, he's always tired and grumpy. This makes for a lot of funny moments, like when a promoter is talking to him about getting him to appear at a drive-in movie screening. The guy's also an enthusiastic fan, and he's kind of goofy, telling him how much of a fan he is, and he says, "You blew my mind." Orlock replies, "Obviously." This is just one part of the story. The other part is about a sniper who's going around killing people for no apparent reason. The sniper seems like an ordinary guy. That's what makes him scarier, because you can't understand what it is that makes him want to shoot people. The most horrifying scene that sticks out to me is when he goes up onto a rooftop overlooking a highway and starts shooting people through the windows of their cars. While he's doing it, he's casual. He's eating a sandwich and drinking a soda like it's a perfectly normal thing, as if he's just playing a video game or something. The whole scene takes place on the rooftop. We never cut away to the people reacting. We never see it from any viewpoint other than his own. The only view of the road is through the crosshairs of the gun. It gives us a very distant, emotionless feeling. It's disturbing, yet downplayed. There's no music to enhance the tension. There's hardly any sound effects other than the gunshots. You never hear anyone scream because they're so far away. Basically, there's nothing exaggerated about the scene. It's very realistic. He's not a perfect shot either. Sometimes he misses. Sometimes another vehicle gets in the way or he gets distracted. It all plays out as it probably would if it was real life. It even happens in what feels like real time. The amount of time it takes for the police to arrive seems like just the right amount of time as it would in a real situation. I could go on and on talking about this one scene, but just see it. These two storylines, the sniper and the horror star, are happening separately, seemingly unrelated, but at the end they both cross over. Also, earlier on, the basic ideas cross over too. This is when Orlock, trying to justify his retirement, picks up a newspaper with a headline about people getting shot to death and says, "Here's your real horror." So the film is acknowledging that the world is changing, that people are more scared of the real-life horrors and not the monsters of the past, but at the same time, it's celebrating the legacy of Karloff. The final scene is a doozy. The sniper's on the loose, fresh after having been chased from the rooftop. He escapes the police and hides out in a drive-in movie theater, which is where Orlock is making his final promotional appearance. The sniper continues to shoot more people at the theater as the tension mounts. Just then, Orlock spots him out and begins walking toward him. At the exact same moment up on the screen, the movie Orlock, which is Karloff in The Terror, is walking in the same way. The sniper looks back and forth from the screen to the real-life person. He takes some badly aimed shots, then freezes up, and then Orlock, wobbling on his cane, comes over and smacks him around. I have mixed feelings about this ending. It kind of breaks the mood. It's silly, but it's also kind of awesome and unexpected to see the classic horror character save the day. Like, you need to learn a thing or two about your elders, son. Smack, smack! From a historical standpoint, when we examine the timeline of horror films and how it progressed and adapted to the audience's changing sensibilities, this is one you can mark right in the middle, a transitionary film between the old and the new. It's aware of the modern sensibilities, but it's also representing the classics. One last representation, a passing of the torch, if you will, to the next horror generation. I got a weird package in the mail. The return address is from a doctor, Dr. Peter Shirtcliffe. I opened it to find this box. It's marked classified, and on the side it says Jepsen files. So what kind of top secret information is in this box? Let's find out. Okay. All right. So, somebody sent me a box of pancakes. All right. So here we have some folders here. Let's see. All right. So it's a newspaper article from 1889. So the article is about a man named Jepsen opening a new pancake factory. Judging by the way it's deliberately ripped and the age of the paper, it has to be fake. But if somebody went through the effort to make a fake newspaper article, then why not make it about something more interesting? And there's more. So far everything's had to do with pancakes. So maybe this will help explain. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Oh my God. Who sent me this? Is it Bigfoot? I thought somehow these things would all relate, but it's just somebody pulling my leg, I think. James, I trust these materials reached your office intact and all's well with you. I fear I've discovered something people won't want to believe, but it's vital you have my back on this. See enclosed evidence. I'll be in contact to explain more soon. Wow, I've had some weird packages before. Once somebody sent me a book of Hamlet and a roll of toilet paper. But this, maybe there's more to it. Is this all just a bunch of random nonsense, or is it actually going somewhere? The doctor even threw in some business cards with phone numbers and websites. I looked them up, and they all seem to point to an actual hospital. Now, truth be told, I got this package years ago. I looked it over with Mike and Bootsy, and we all laughed our asses off. The only conclusion we came to was that it was somebody pulling a joke, nothing more. But then, a second package came. It contained a new letter from the doctor, a winning trophy for a flapjack festival. Yeah, the pancake theme's still going on. There's an ad for the flapjack festival. But then things take a dark turn with a newspaper clipping about murders. Also, a piece of a bloody shirt, a photo of bloody pancakes, and then this. This is the first photo that looked deliberately staged. Now it's clear that there's something to it, a movie tie-in or something. With the first package, I just laughed it off and moved on, but this time I looked further into it. I found that another website, Shock Till You Drop, was receiving the same packages, and it was a viral marketing campaign for an independent horror film. The third and final package I received contained a lunchbox full of items from Good Friends Church Camp and behind-the-scenes photos. The movie Lumberjack Man was released in 2015. I saw it on cable on demand, so it's out there now. Had it not been for these packages, I probably wouldn't have heard about it. I think it was a very clever idea. When promoting an independent film, sometimes you have to be creative. This isn't just a movie review, it's more of a review about the viral marketing behind it. But here's the review part. It's set on a campground where there's lots of drugs and sex going on, and there's an undead serial killer who's murdering people. It's your typical slasher plot, except the backstory for the killer, the lumberjack, is something that I guarantee you've never heard before. There's an animated sequence explaining that he was murdered by Mr. Jepsen for his pancake recipe. Because his pancakes were so good, Jepsen drowned him in syrup, stole his recipe, and made a fortune off it. Now the lumberjack is back from the dead and stalking the campground. Everywhere he goes, he's pulling a wagon full of giant pancakes, which he sometimes uses to smash people's faces apart. Yes, killing them with the pancakes or using their blood for syrup. Obviously, this is not a serious film. It's more like a spoof of the slasher genre, and it goes full steam ahead with the exploitation. There is boobs, boobs, and more boobs, and of course blood, blood, and more blood. It reminds me of a trauma film. The funniest part, I think, is a scene where some guys are spying on a girl who's getting undressed. I think Animal House was the first big example of that cliche, but this is probably the funniest, most exaggerated version of the window voyeur trope I've ever seen. Not only does she undress completely, but she touches herself all over and covers her body in lotion. When would that ever happen? There's some pretty good kills. The effects are much better than you'd expect for a low-budget movie, and all around, the production design and cinematography is all good. If you compare it to Sleepaway Camp and the first couple Friday the 13th movies, it looks great, so visually it's better than a lot of the movies it's spoofing. The acting is all traditionally terrible, with lots of disposable characters who are introduced to be almost immediately killed, such as the cocaine-snorting bus driver. But there's one standout performance. Michael Madsen, who I've always known best from Reservoir Dogs, he's awesome playing the part of Dr. Peter Shirtcliffe, the character who was supposedly writing me the letters. So now when I read the letters, I can imagine it in his voice. The doctor is investigating the trail of the killer. His role fits the same purpose as Dr. Loomis in Halloween. While there are lots of funny moments to keep you entertained, there's also lots of parts that drag. For example, it opens with a scene on a school bus that lasts for roughly 6 minutes. There's many scenes like that where you just want to move on. It sticks to the basic slasher formula, so it doesn't feel like anything that radically different. Even though it twists some of the cliches or exaggerates them a bit, it still comes off a bit like old material. But if you're in that kind of mood, check it out.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Top 10 Tuesday.
Here's the last part of my top horror marathons. This time we cover the Bronze Age. To me, the Bronze Age includes the 70s and 80s, which upped the ante for gore and broke all new grounds, which has never been topped since. It's the last true classic era of horror before the modern age began. So once again, I'm splitting the list by decade, top 10 of the 70s and top 10 of the 80s. Let's begin. Top 10 70s horror films. An honorable mention goes to Black Christmas. It's one of the first holiday slasher films, and without it, we wouldn't have had Halloween. Also got to mention Alice Sweet Alice, Tourist Trap, and the Nosferatu remake. But there's still probably a bunch I'm forgetting about. I've already had to revise this script at least 7 times because I keep forgetting something. Alright, number 10. The Omen. I never compromise with these lists, but The Omen I think is a bit overrated. So I put it on this list not as one of my personal favorites, but as one that I recommend so that you can see it and make your own judgment. Number 9. Last House on the Left from Wes Craven and Sean Cunningham. Not a perfect film, there's some weird comedy interludes with the dopey police officers, but the main story is as shocking and disturbing as they come, with a group of psychopaths who torture and rape women. It's horrible, a true horror film by definition, and the low-budget look makes it seem so much more authentic. Number 8. Suspiria from Dario Argento. Loose on narrative structure, but the film's true power is in its striking visuals and its doomy sound design. When I think of atmospheric horror, I usually think black and white, but this is a movie that shows that the use of color can provide a strong atmosphere of its own. It's a very surreal experience. Number 7. Carrie, based on the Stephen King story. It's the story of a high school girl with telekinetic powers. She's not a horror villain. She's an otherwise normal, shy girl who's more the victim than anything. You feel really bad for her, especially when she's abused by her over-religious, psychotic mother. The finale, when she's forced into using her powers, is the grand highlight. Number 6. The Exorcist. This is the one that's often called the scariest film ever made. It won 2 Academy Awards, but nominated for 10 and nominated for 7 Golden Globes. This was during the devil age of horror films, where any movie to have this kind of theme got praise and mainstream attention, whereas any other horror film, they wouldn't give a shit. I don't think it's the best, but still, it's great. It's so serious and unflinching, so balls to the wall, uncompromising in its horror delivery. Number 5. Ridley Scott's Alien. I would have included Aliens also, but that's more of an action movie than horror. Either way, they're both awesome. Alien is simply a horror movie set in outer space. It uses the classic format of people trapped in a haunted house or being stalked by a monster or killer, but here they're trapped on a spaceship with an alien. The first half of the movie is the most suspenseful, and that's the part I think is best. It's a great build-up. Number 4. Dawn of the Dead. This sequel to Night of the Living Dead has no close connection and follows a new group of characters, but it's set in the same world with the dead taking over. The shopping mall setting is the perfect idea to hide from a zombie apocalypse. The group is very resourceful in their fight against the zombies and against the motorcycle gang that tries to take the mall for themselves. There's some great dark comedy as well, and it sort of compares mall shoppers to zombies. In some ways, it surpasses the first film. Number 3. Halloween. This is the film that borrowed all the ideas of psychopathic killers and put it all into one thing and gave birth to the slasher genre. It made Michael Myers a household name and made a scream queen out of Jamie Lee Curtis. It doesn't rely much on gore, it's all about the suspense of being followed. It uses Halloween as an innocent backdrop to the real horror that is coming, which makes it a prime film to watch this time of year. Love Donald Pleasence as Dr. Loomis. He's the archetype, like Van Helsing, who's hunting the evil. And John Carpenter's score is a big part of it, you can't forget. Number 2. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is the only film about a human killer that can surpass Halloween, arguably. I see them as equals, but Chainsaw came first. They're both different. Chainsaw is more explicit with its violence, though there still isn't much gore. You never actually see a chainsaw cutting anyone. It still provokes just as much horror as if it did. The Psycho family in this are so horrible, it's actually difficult to watch, and it has such a low-budget look, it feels like you're watching a documentary. Truly horrifying. And the number 1 70s horror film? Jaws. The first blockbuster movie that made people afraid to go into the ocean and that launched the career of Steven Spielberg. It's basically a monster movie about a group of people on a boat hunting a shark. It's a big-budget remake of Creature from the Black Lagoon. Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw are all excellent. You spend so much time with these 3 characters, you feel like you're on the boat with them. I love how one minute they're showing each other their wounds, they're joking around, and then the next minute Quint is telling them this bone-chilling story and they all get serious. And then they're all singing, and next minute they're being attacked by the shark. It goes through many changes. It's a roller coaster ride. Now, on to the 80s. First, I just have to say, this is really tough. There are so many, and they're all so different, and what makes it harder is that there's so much horror comedy in the 80s. Many films on this list are going to overlap with comedy, so it's hard to decide where to draw the line. Ghostbusters is one of the best, but that's mainly a comedy. More comedy than horror, I'd say, where I want to focus on ones that are mainly horror. Then there's Gremlins, which is definitely one of my favorite films of all time. It certainly has its horror aspects, but it might be a little too much of a comedy to fit in. Otherwise, if you don't agree, put Gremlins at number 1. Done. Also, Reanimator, Creepshow, Monster Squad, Night of the Creeps, Toxic Avenger, Fright Night, American Werewolf in London. Come to think of it, this was the decade of horror comedy. It could have been a whole other top 10. Damn, this has turned into a mess. This could have been another top 20 inside of a top 20, and it would have never gotten done in time. And with more serious horror, I have to give some honorable mentions to Inferno, the first Evil Dead, the remake of The Thing, and Psycho 2, which is surprisingly good, mostly due to Anthony Perkins. I don't think you should take the ranking of these films too seriously. They're all good recommendations. So let's get down to it. Number 10. A big shout out to Jason Voorhees, who's one of the most recognizable characters of the decade. If I had to pick one of the Friday the 13th films, it would have to be Part 4, the final chapter. Overall, I think that's the best one, with the exception of the final act in the original film with Mrs. Voorhees and Jason coming out of the lake. That was excellent. You can take bits and pieces from the whole series, so it's kind of tough to pick just one. Number 9. Pumpkinhead. Lance Henriksen blames some boys for the accidental death of his son, so he goes to an old witch who resurrects a monster out of a pumpkin patch to terrorize them. I may have underestimated this film for a while. I rewatched it on Blu-ray last Halloween, and I was really impressed with the visuals. The outdoor nighttime cinematography, the woods, the collapsed church, the witch's lair, it all looks amazing. The monster, created by Stan Winston and team, is unbelievable. It's part suit, part animatronics, and it looks so fucking good. It's proof that this type of craft kept getting better over the years until it was phased out prematurely by CG. Number 8. Hellraiser. This definitely gave us a new face of horror, the Cenobites led by Pinhead. This stretches the imagination. The plot is truly absurd, with a guy who starts out as a decaying pile of guts underneath the floorboards after having summoned the Cenobites with a strange puzzle box. Then he has to regenerate all his flesh with the blood of living victims. This is the kind of movie that doesn't fuck around. It's not trying to give you a fun, spooky time. It's trying to freak you out of your mind. Number 7. The remake of The Fly, also a major gore fest, but disturbs you on the emotional level too. The effects are incredible. Jeff Goldblum is also great as a scientist who invents a teleportation unit but turns himself into a human fly. The main difference from the original is that here he gradually becomes the fly over time, so you get to see him slowly falling apart, literally. A great remake, but do not forget the original. Number 6. The Shining from Stanley Kubrick. I would warn anyone who's seeing it for the first time that it's very slow-paced. It's about a writer who takes a job as the winter caretaker of a grand old hotel with a haunting backstory. Over the course of the film, he goes slowly insane. It's a steady journey into madness. The story is loose, but has a strange power that grows on you. And above all, Jack Nicholson is excellent. He makes the film. Number 5. Poltergeist, a joint effort of Spielberg and Tobe Hooper. It's about a regular family who realize too late their house is on a haunted burial ground. The spirits target their young daughter, pulling her into the dimensional portal, and the family has to get her back. For a ghost movie, this is not subtle whatsoever. There's a guy ripping his face off, there's a scary clown, corpses coming up in the swimming pool. It's horrifying, and all the metaphysical talk gets under my skin. Ghost movies don't usually do it for me, but this here is an entirely different beast. Number 4. Nightmare on Elm Street, the movie that made everyone afraid to go to sleep. What a great idea. If your nightmares can hurt you, you're fucked. Freddy Krueger is one of the true faces of fear among kids in the 80s. Unlike other slasher villains who were usually masked, Freddy had a face, a voice, and one hell of a personality. The idea that anything could happen in a dream opened up all kinds of creative possibilities. Part 3 might be my favorite, but if you're new, I say start with the original. Number 3. Day of the Dead. Third in Romero's Dead series, this is the one that most people don't like the first time they see it, but I think on repeat viewings it keeps getting better and better. This is the darkest, most claustrophobic of the Dead films as we go underground to see that the last survivors are in the hands of a military operation run by the ruthless Captain Rhodes. He steals the show. One mean son of a bitch. The theme of the Dead films becomes complete here with the dehumanization of humans and the rise of the dead. Also, the Tom Savini gore effects are some of the best ever. Number 2. Return of the Living Dead. A lot of people hear the title and think it's a sequel to one of the Dead films, but it's not. It's totally unrelated. So watch it. You're good to go. This is a different take on the zombie genre. Here, you can't kill them by shooting them in the head. It's the nerves, which you can't do anything about. If you sever an arm, the arm crawls around. Every part is independent. This raises the stakes and makes for a much scarier threat. I wonder why nobody copied these kind of zombies. Also, these zombies are smarter. They can talk, and they specifically eat brains. And it contains some elements of dark comedy. What makes it funny is how the characters panic and are constantly making the wrong decisions, making the situation worse and worse. Every second is entertaining. And the number 1 80s horror film, Evil Dead 2. This is partly a remake of the first film, so you don't need to see the original to understand it. There's not much to the plot, it's all just an over-the-top melee, blending horror, action, and comedy, though it's still mainly horror. Bruce Campbell has a great knack for physical slapstick, and he takes a lot of abuse. And director Sam Raimi had a field day with inventing all kinds of camera tricks. The camera is always flying around the place, going through windows and cars. The whole movie is a whirlwind. I can't do it justice. Just watch it. Following the 80s began the modern age. Here, the world got so burnt out with horror that they had to resort to parodying horror with movies like Scream, which I think in a nutshell defines the audience's sensibilities of the 90s. I don't mean it's the best. There were tons of great ones in the 90s. Misery, Candyman, Silence of the Lambs, lots of them. But the majority of modern age horror films are mainly repeating what was already done in the Bronze Age, even remaking every major film from it. Every now and then something original comes along, but as a whole, the modern age is not breaking any new ground. Even though we're 2.5 decades in, I still haven't seen enough where I'd feel comfortable doing a top 10. Not yet, at least. I'm still watching and still waiting for the next new great thing.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. What the fuck, Wednesday?
When you're talking about cult movies, the biggest example is the musical horror spoof Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's a crazy film, but it's more than that. It's a social phenomenon. It came out in 1975 and is still playing here and there, never truly leaving theaters. It's considered to be the longest running theatrical film release in history. I like cult movies. I like Plan 9 from Outer Space, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, stuff like that, but this is an entirely different beast. There's sort of a plot, just enough of one to string together all the musical scenes. It's about a newly engaged couple, Janet and Brad, whose car breaks down during a thunderstorm. They arrive at a castle for help. Sounds very typical, but it isn't at all. The castle is full of all kinds of wild characters who are celebrating a convention, and the host is Tim Curry playing a vampire transvestite from transsexual Transylvania who happens to be a scientist and an alien. It makes lots of references to classic horror and sci-fi films, but twists it all in such a weird, chaotic fashion that I lack words to describe it. It's not even a film you're supposed to review. You're just supposed to see it, and in a theater with an audience. The first time I saw it on home video, I didn't get what the big deal was. I knew it was supposed to be the most celebrated cult film ever, but I couldn't see why. The songs were good. I liked the upbeat rock and roll vibe. The meatloaf scene was the highlight for me. I enjoyed all the horror tributes, but overall, it's an insane mess. Then I went to a horror convention one time and caught the traditional midnight screening. People were dressed up like the characters, there were props, everybody shouting out jokes. It was nuts, and I still don't know what to make of it, but one thing is for sure, that's what gives it the cult status it deserves. Let me back up and tell the history. It started as a stage musical in the early 70s before it was adapted into the film, but the film is what gave it its popularity. It was critically panned when it first came out. That makes sense because the definition of cult film is a film that the mainstream does not like, but the underground, the true fans, love it. After a while, the film started playing in a limited run at midnight, which always became the tradition after that, and then people were showing up again and again and began wearing costumes and acting out the film in front of the film. The whole audience participation aspect of it has turned into a standard. There's certain quotes that you're supposed to shout out at certain times, and there's even books that lay it all out as a guide. When the Time Warp song is going on, everybody stands. It doesn't matter if you came there just to watch. Somebody's going to pick you up out of your seat. The movie became less of a movie and more of a live performance with the movie as the backdrop. It started on the stage, went to the screen, and now it's like a mixed media production. I still don't quite get it, but I respect what it's done. It truly is a cult phenomenon.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Bloodthirsty Thursday.
Mel Brooks made one of the greatest horror spoofs of all time, Young Frankenstein. It only seems fitting that he eventually did something with Dracula, too. This is Dracula Dead and Loving It, starring Leslie Nielsen. This time I was alive, so I could actually see it in theaters when it came out in 1995. I was deep in my horror phase, discovering all the classics, so I was completely overjoyed that a mainstream current film was playing tribute to the original Dracula, as well as Nosferatu and the Hammer Dracula films. I found it odd that while Young Frankenstein was in black and white to emulate the classic look, this one was in color. I suppose it made sense for the bloody scenes, and after all, the Hammer films were in color. The opening credits might be the best part, with a montage of creepy images. It's legitimately disturbing with the music and one scary picture after another. It's completely devoid of comedy. If you showed me this without telling me anything, and I didn't know the name Mel Brooks, I would have looked at this and thought this was a serious horror movie. I'd even say it might be the best opening to any vampire film ever. It's way better than it needs to be. How does this come before a silly comedy? Mel Brooks, who's pushed a lot of boundaries and made some of the funniest comedies of all time, here the formula's gotten a little weaker. It's not as consistently funny as some of his earlier efforts, but it has its highlights. Mainly the guy who plays Renfield, Peter MacNicol, who you might recognize as Janosch from Ghostbusters 2. He is great. I swear he's the reincarnation of Dwight Fry. He does such a great imitation that it feels like I'm watching more scenes of the original Renfield. And Renfield in the original is a funny character to begin with, so it was appropriate. It's strange. It's as if the same guy jumped from a horror film into a comedy, but didn't need to change the way he acts. There's lots of great moments, like when Renfield first visits Transylvania and says, "I'm on schedule to meet Dracula." One by one, everybody goes, "Dracula? Dracula? Schedule?" And when Dr. Sewer introduces Van Helsing and says he's a doctor of psychology and theology, and then Van Helsing adds, "and gynecology," Dr. Seward says, "Oh, you have your hand in that too." But these are some of the quicker, cheap jokes. As far as scenes go, there's the part where Dr. Seward is eating with Renfield, and Renfield keeps snatching flies and bugs and eating them and trying to hide it like, "Oh, I'm not doing anything." And the whole time he has that weird grin on his face. Dr. Seward gets so agitated by it. The back and forth between them is really funny. I didn't think so the first time, but this scene has grown on me. Then there's the parts whenever Dracula controls somebody under his hypnotic power. You'd never stop and think what kind of problems would arise. Sometimes he walks them into a wall or they trip on something. And when there's more than one person, it becomes this complicated game of, you go here, no, you go here, you go back to sleep, you sit down, no, you stand up. And the moment that made me laugh to tears when I first saw it in the theater was the staking scene. When they stake the vampire, there's gallons of blood spraying. I had never seen anything like that at the time. Now, I've seen Evil Dead and Dead Alive, which came before, so it's not as big a deal now, but back then when I saw it, I couldn't believe how much blood they were able to show. Just the fact that I'm able to rattle off these scenes means the film definitely has its moments, even though everybody else seems to think it's a total bore. This film had and still has such a negative reception that I don't agree with. I agree that it's not consistently funny, but it has lots of great moments, and above all is a tribute to classic horror, which you don't see often in a mainstream film. I believe most audiences didn't get all the references and how far they went to include so many things from all the classic Dracula films, like the way he rises from his coffin like in Nosferatu, but here he hits his head on the chandelier. They even make fun of that stupid hairdo from Coppola's Dracula. Sadly, this was the last film that Mel Brooks ever directed, and also, for this type of exaggerated comedy, that entire parody genre seemed to die off around this time. The Naked Guns, the National Lampoons, the Hot Shots movies, all that. This was the last dying gasp from that era. I guess times have changed.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Franken Friday.
It's not surprising that there's so many Frankenstein movies since the novel is in the public domain. Any filmmaker is free to take the idea, to retell it, to adapt it, to do anything they please. Many of these are straight to DVD or made for television. Others are theatrical releases such as I, Frankenstein, where the monster is fighting demons in a dystopian world. Yeah, anything goes. Then there's Frankenstein's army set during World War II. Here the Nazis are using Frankenstein's methods of reanimating dead body parts to create an army. So you can't say they haven't tried anything different. These movies are all over the place, and every year there's more. The most recent addition that I've seen that's fresh in memory is Victor Frankenstein, released in 2015. This is it, the most recent Frankenstein film to be featured in Monster Madness. Here's the basic gist. Frankenstein, played by James McAvoy, recruits a circus performer, Igor, played by Daniel Radcliffe, to help him with his experiments of... what else? Creating life. Igor, by the way, is in classic hunchback form, just like the various assistants in all the Universal films, but not for long. Early in the film, Frankenstein gets him to stand up straight by draining the giant cyst on his back and then ramming him against a wall. Then there's the typical inspector who's suspicious of their experiments. Doesn't it all sound like something we've seen before? It sure sticks to the classics, doesn't it? There's also a subplot where Igor has an affair with another circus performer who he saved from an injury in the opening scene. This creates a problem with Victor because he sees her as a distraction. Then Victor gives life to monster number 1, which is some kind of weird chimpanzee. It's pretty grotesque looking. Sadly, this might be the most original creative scene in the whole movie. After this failed experiment, Victor begins monster number 2, and this time things are complicated by a classmate of his, villain number 2 if you count the inspector. The classmate wants to kill Victor and use the monster as a weapon. This all amounts to a climactic scene in the lab, just like all the classic films, where the monster gets up in the last act and flips his shit. And the monster himself, well, it looks a lot like the classic image we all know. I found myself grinning, realizing the times haven't changed as much as I thought. While this film doesn't explore any new interesting directions, it gave me an unexpected nostalgia kick that I was watching another classic Frankenstein film that I've never seen. And I don't mean the true classics like the ones from James Whale. I mean more like the Hammer films, but more specifically the sequels, the more exploitive, run-of-the-mill ones. For example, when Victor has the eyes in a tank and uses a flame to get them to react, that's right out of Revenge of Frankenstein. The laboratory set would have perfectly fit in with the Hammer Age. You always got to have that big electrical switch for epic effect. It wouldn't be cool if it was just an ordinary switch, if you did this. Click. No, it's got to be like... Also, there's the exterior shot with lightning striking the castle. All the cliches are there. I don't know what this film's agenda was. It's not a remake of any particular film, nor is it a faithful adaptation of the book in any way. I feel like it's just a modern-day equivalent of a traditional Frankenstein film. It's the most common, basic thing it could have done. For the general public, I do not recommend this. It's not a great film in any way. There's not much of a point of this film even existing, but if you're a big Frankenstein fan and you love all the classics, you might see it in a different light.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Prepare to be scared. Monsters will walk in the audience. Ghosts will roam the aisles. Theater is turned into graveyard and your seats into coffins. You've seen all those kinds of ads, but have you ever wondered, what was this really about? Well, the truth is, most of us today will never know. That's why I want to talk about a very important period in horror history, a huge lost era that roughly spanned the 30s to the 60s. This was the Midnight Spook Show, or the Ghost Show. These were live performances, and there exists very few photographs and no film footage to my knowledge. It would have been hard to capture images of these anyway, because a great deal of them happened in low lighting or complete darkness. All we're left with are a bunch of awesome ads, radio clips, and trailers. In the 30s, during the Depression, entertainment flourished because people needed that escape from reality. Movie theaters at the time were much more classy than they are today. They were called movie palaces. Most of them were built in the 20s during the silent era. They had organs, chandeliers, and most important, stages in front of the screen. So it was an age of mixed medium. You had movies and live performances in the same venues. It was here that the Ghost Show began. They started mainly as magic shows, but the whole novelty was that they do the show at midnight and include seances to contact spirits of the dead. So the magician would make tables float in the air or a person and do things of that nature. But the main event, the finale, would be what they'd call a blackout, where all the lights in the theater would go out for about 3 minutes, and then the audiences would hear all kinds of sound effects and glowing ghosts would fly by. Back then, luminescent paint was a relatively new discovery. Nowadays, you can go to any dollar store around Halloween and find something that glows in the dark, but back then, to sit in a dark theater and see things glow was a pretty unique thing. They also took advantage of what you couldn't see. The performer would have assistants going through the audience, grabbing people in the arm or whatever. Sometimes members of the audience would start grabbing their friends or throwing popcorn off the balcony, and it would land in somebody's hair and they'd think it was spiders or something. It was a party. It was a free-for-all. But sometimes it got out of hand. You'd never know what was going to happen. There's been reports of people robbing the box office during the darkness. Not only did they turn the lights out in the auditorium, but the lobby too, because if any light got into the auditorium, it would ruin the effects. So sometimes they would turn off the power at the breaker. Right after the blackout, they would show a horror movie. Sometimes the movie would have something to do with the show, like if the show had some kind of voodoo zombie theme, the movie would be White Zombie or something like that. I'm unclear as to whether the movie would usually start at midnight or the performance started at midnight, but the blackout was the main draw. That's what people would come to know. There was a scare factor. Depending how well the magician built up to it, they would convince you that you were about to see real ghosts. It's easy to think that these shows must have been real cheesy and non-scary, but it all depended on the performer. If you had somebody really talented running the show with great skill in magic, hypnotism, ventriloquism, you could have a really great show. The performer needed to have a great personality and the ability to handle a crowd. As a performer, it must have been a little scary too, because you don't know what a crowd is going to do. They might riot. Who knows? During World War II, it made it harder for these performers to travel from theater to theater, and audiences weren't as scared during this time because of the more urgent things that were going on in the news. By the 50s, these ghost shows got really huge again. Now, there was a new generation of teenagers going to see these. This generation had more exposure to horror movies because the theaters would always re-show the old classics like Dracula and Frankenstein, so a lot of the ghost shows would include appearances by some of the famous monsters. Jack Baker was a magician who went by the name Dr. Silkini. He would always include a Frankenstein monster. On the ads, the monster was always depicted the same way as in the Universal films, so Universal sent him a cease and desist, but after they saw the potential, they worked with him by officially licensing out the monster. So the ads would now say things like, "Direct from Hollywood, see the Frankenstein monster in person." Sometimes they'd actually have actors like Glenn Strange, Lon Chaney Jr., and Bela Lugosi show up. The funniest thing is when the ads would say, "See King Kong in person." Could you imagine going to a show and thinking you're going to see the real King Kong? But the audiences of this time were a bit tougher, more rowdy, and not as easily scared. So this is when they ramped up the horror part of these ghost shows. When you think of the whole evolution, they began like traditional magic shows, then focused more on the seances, and now it was all about horror, monster madness. Raymond Corbin would have volunteers come up to the stage and he'd take a butcher knife and cut their heads off. Obviously not for real. They'd either turn out the lights or do some other kind of distraction while he switched to a fake severed head. But then he'd run through the crowd with it into the lobby and then up into the balcony. Supposedly he would jump from the balcony with this severed head. Meanwhile, there's a person in a gorilla suit running through the audience, ripping off people's limbs. Could you imagine? It must have been crazy. During this time, they would ramp up the sex and violence. The shows were gorier and the female assistants would wear less clothing. Speaking of women, the advertisements would always play it up like, "Make sure your boyfriend protects you." As you'd expect from that time, it was very sexist. Even the ads would say, "See if your boyfriend is really a man. It separates the men from the boys." But often I'm sure the guys would be the ones getting scared. So the movie would play after the show, but it didn't necessarily mean the show and the movie were two separate things. In the 60s, there was horror vision, a gimmick employed in movies like Monsters Crash the Pajama Party, where a gorilla would leave the screen and then an actor in a gorilla suit would come out into the audiences and grab people. The victims were actors planted in the audience who were dressed like the characters in the movie, so when the gorilla returned to the movie screen, it would seem like the characters were dragged into the movie. William Castle was a big name in this field. He was known for always having gimmicks attached to his movies, like skeletons coming out of the screen or buzzers in the seats. Special glasses that make you see the ghosts, giving audiences a life insurance certificate should they die of fright during the film, and stationing nurses in the lobby. But William Castle came towards the end of all this. His gimmicks had to be mass-produced throughout all the theaters in the country. Maybe they didn't have enough buzzers to put in the chairs, or maybe they didn't have enough skeletons, so it didn't always go well. It was just a marketing thing. So you can kind of view this as a cheap mass market version of the ghost show. The ghost show gradually faded away. I've heard it went all the way into the 70s, but by then there were hardly any left. There were many reasons for the decline. First of all, there were so many that a lot of less talented performers started doing it to make a quick buck. Everybody was trying to get in on it. The market became too saturated, and with so many bad ghost shows out there, people started losing interest. Television got big, and the movie industry competed by making more films in color, in 3D, and in widescreen format, so the theaters had to update. A lot of the great movie palaces of the past were either being modified or demolished. Previously, during the ghost show performances, they could pull the screen up into the ceiling, but now the new widescreens were more permanent fixtures, so the performers were forced to work around it. The stages were smaller or non-existent, so the movie theaters were now tailoring more towards movies. Also, there were drive-in movies. They'd still do ghost shows at drive-ins sometimes, but it was a completely different type of venue. Being outdoors with a ton of car headlights pointed at you made the blackout segment impossible. Also, with the audience being inside their cars, it probably affected the interaction between the performer and the crowd. Also, there were rising costs. The movie studios got greedy with their costs for renting out the movies to the theaters, and there were also new union costs. After paying everyone from the electrician to the janitor, there were no profits left. Before, midnight was a great time slot for the theaters, while nothing else was playing at that time anyway, but now midnight meant a whole lot of extra costs. Some ghost show personalities like Philip Morris, known as Dr. Evil, began appearing on television hosting horror movies. This type of thing led to a whole new genre of TV horror hosts like Zachary and Vampira. The idea is similar, of putting on an act of some kind and then showing a movie. Every medium leads to another, beginning with theater and magic shows, to ghost shows, to movies and television. Even though ghost shows no longer accompany movies, I think they still exist in some form, as haunted houses. Halloween has become a whole new rising industry. Today we can experience the fun and frights of walking through a haunted attraction, but we'll never know what the ghost shows were like. The best source of information I've ever found is the book Ghost Masters by Mark Walker. If you want to know more, I recommend it. With a movie, there's always some kind of physical record of its history, as long as a copy still survives, but the ghost shows were unique events. Unless you were alive back then, there's no way you can see one. As a horror fan, it saddens me that this is something I'll never experience. Even if somebody tries to recreate one, the world is so different today. The social climate of that time could never be emulated. You'd never be able to experience the way audiences experienced it back then.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness.
Halloween is a time of year that is both playful and scary. Jokes and frights, tricks and treats. There's no story that so perfectly embodies Halloween as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Even though Halloween as we know today wasn't even established back then, it still captures the spirit. It's a glimpse into a small town where people tell ghost stories and play pranks on each other. See my video, A Trip to Sleepy Hollow, where I visit the real-life location, search for the Headless Horseman Bridge, and go further in depth of what makes the story so special. It's immortal like a nursery rhyme. It's been retold again and again, and with any story like that, it tends to get changed a lot for new generations. But one of the most drastic changes, the most wildest off-the-wall retelling, was Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow in 1999. There's been many film versions, many which were made for TV, lots of them were parodies or spin-offs. There was a lot out there. But when this came out, it was big. This wasn't just another Sleepy Hollow movie. This was mainstream, in theaters, Tim Burton, big budget, Johnny Depp, the whole deal. This was a big chance to give a faithful adaptation of the story, to put it into the public consciousness, to make the definitive Sleepy Hollow movie. But that didn't happen. Not that it was bad, it just wasn't the real story. The plot of this movie is completely insane. It has almost nothing to do with the original tale. That doesn't mean I don't like it, but just hear me out. First, I want to talk about the major differences. Instead of Ichabod being a school teacher, he's an investigator, and he goes to Sleepy Hollow to investigate the murders done by the Headless Horseman. Brom Bones is still in there. He still has sort of a rivalry with Ichabod over Katrina Van Tassel, but it's not played up as much as in the book. Brom still dresses up like the Headless Horseman and throws the pumpkin at Ichabod, but instead of it only being implied that it was Brom playing a prank, here it was definitely him. But the Headless Horseman is also real and is going around cutting off heads. So, okay, the Headless Horseman is definitely real. That's just one little twist, but it goes much further than that. There's a witch, basically, who's using the horseman's skull to control him, which I think makes the horseman less scary because he doesn't act on his own. He's just somebody's pawn. There's a tree of the dead, which is the horseman's grave marker, but also a portal into the world of the dead. The tree bleeds, there's heads inside it, and the witch has this complex motive about trying to get back a family fortune by killing off those who have inherited it. So it's very fair to say this is not reliant on its source material. You have to look at this as its own story. It's something new and entirely different. So other than that, what else does it have going on? Well, the visuals are amazing. I have to get that out of the way. In fact, when I saw this in the theater, I was blown away. I loved the credit sequence especially. All those wide shots, those deep scenic views of Sleepy Hollow are mesmerizing to look at. Every one of those shots is a work of art that I would hang on my wall if I had more wall space. The tone is strange. I still don't really know what to make of it, but it seems like it's meant to be funny. There's an unnecessary amount of blood. It always seems to be squirting onto somebody's face for no real reason, and it's always bright red to stand out amongst the gloomy scenery. The last film I can recall to have that style of blood was Dawn of the Dead, but there's probably tons of other examples. It's also very much inspired by the Hammer films. No surprise that Tim Burton is always getting veteran horror stars like Vincent Price and Edward Scissorhands. Now he has Michael Gough and Christopher Lee, who's in a small part, but still, wow, it was unexpected. When I first saw this, I couldn't believe Christopher Lee was in it. Keep in mind, this was before Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies and the Star Wars prequels, where a whole new generation got to know who Christopher Lee is. Lee retired from horror movies in the 70s, so it was really awesome to see him here. They even put him in front of some kind of eagle statue, which makes it look like he has bat wings spreading out. I've always heard that he didn't like being associated so much with the Dracula movies. Even though he escaped the same kind of typecasting that Lugosi had, he was very reluctant in starring in all the Dracula sequels, so I can't help but chuckle at this scene as if they just slipped it behind him. To get back to the gore, there's an unheard of amount of head decapitations. At that time, I had never seen so many heads get cut off on screen in a mainstream film like that. Even the poster said, "Heads will roll." There's all the traditional Tim Burton freak-out moments, like when the horseman's skull is returned to his body and his face regenerates. For at least one brief moment, it looks like Large Marge from Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and when the face is fully formed, it's Christopher Walken with sharp teeth. How much more badass can you get? There's many homages to classic horror films like the windmill burning from Frankenstein, although here the windmill of course has to explode. Everything's over the top. It's a non-serious take on a classic story, and it jumbles many ideas together. I have mixed feelings about it because it's a very mixed film. You might say there's already been enough movies based on Sleepy Hollow and that it should take a unique twist and do something different. But this was a chance to introduce the story to a new generation and with big production values. It could have been the ultimate Sleepy Hollow movie. I still like the idea of a crazy spin-off, but I wish it was two separate films. I guess if you want to see a really good and faithful enough retelling of the story, see the Disney animated version, Ichabod. It's grouped together with the Mr. Toad story, but every Halloween I always skip to the Ichabod part. Ever since I was a kid, Disney's Ichabod has always been a tradition to watch every year.
Cinemassacre Monster Madness. Modern Monday.
Well, it's Halloween, so why not review a Christmas movie? A Christmas horror movie, Krampus. There's been tons of Christmas horror movies over the decades, and many involving an evil Santa. There is even another Krampus movie from 2013, but this is the 2015 version we're talking about, the one that was a major theatrical release. Anyway, what caught my eye on this one is that it was written and directed by Michael Dougherty, or Dougherty. He's the guy who made Trick or Treat, which was probably the most Halloweenish Halloween movie ever made. But I already reviewed Trick or Treat, so how about Krampus? Especially since I came close to reviewing it last year, but by the time I saw it, Star Wars The Force Awakens was out, and I needed 31 horror movies, so better to save it. Krampus is basically an evil version of Santa from European folklore. While St. Nicholas would reward the good children, Krampus would punish the naughty ones. It begins with your average family stressing out over the holidays and not getting along with relatives. It's a lot like Home Alone or National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Here, a young boy, Max, runs up to his room, disenchanted with the holiday spirit, and tears up a letter he wrote to Santa. This sets off a curse. A freak blizzard hits, the electricity in the whole neighborhood goes out, and then a whole army of assorted holiday monsters wreak havoc. Going into this movie, knowing it was going to be some kind of evil Santa, this caught me off guard. I didn't expect such an abundance of Christmas creatures and less focus on Krampus. There's snowmen, teddy bears, gingerbread men, a jack-in-the-box, elves, and finally, the title character appears at the very end, looking very creepy with a perpetual open jaw. Even though there's some genuinely creepy moments, it's largely a very tongue-in-cheek, fun movie. The gingerbread men are especially humorous. Anytime you have a bunch of tiny guys running after you, it's funny. It's like Army of Darkness, and their voices sound just like the Gremlins. The effects are great. It seems like they use CG when it's absolutely necessary, but thankfully most of the time it's practical. I also really like the wintry landscapes, which gives you the sense of cold nature closing in on you. The characters are kind of stock, but they all handle the parts well. Each actor sticks to their respective archetype and plays it consistently. The best character is the grandma, who's had a past experience with Krampus. This is all told through a great flashback scene in a stop-motion style. Stop-motion also seems to be a Christmas tradition. There's one tiny thing that confuses me. For the first half of the movie, the grandma speaks in German, but she's having conversations all the time with Max. Her dialogue is in German, but his is in English, so they go back and forth speaking two different languages. I don't understand why that was necessary. I just thought it was an odd choice. And as soon as we get to the flashback, she switches to English. Come to think of it, a bigger thing that bothers me is that they're trying to find the daughter who's out in the blizzard, and you'd think they'd be more urgent. Any parent would be panicking and going crazy, but instead they're always calm about it, like, oh, we'll find her eventually. There's a lot of things this movie reminds me of, like The Mist, which is about people trapped in a store while an intense fog envelops everything and brings monsters with it. But mainly, it's a throwback to older films like the Puppet Master series or anything from the Full Moon Company. It seems like something that could have been made in the 80s or 90s direct to video, except done on a bigger scale and released in theaters. I would have been interested to see it done as a serious holiday horror film and not as much of a horror comedy. It seems almost like it was trying to be the ultimate Christmas horror comedy, and if so, it was a good attempt, but you still can't top Gremlins. Anyway, it's Halloween. Have a good one, and make sure to go back and watch my older reviews if you haven't. There's now 10 years of Monster Madness history. Even movies I've reviewed outside of Monster Madness, there's hundreds. The first year was good for a basic history, a horror film 101. There was the Godzilla-thon with reviews of all the Godzilla movies. The third year I opened it up to a whole grab bag of random horror films, both famous and obscure. Then there was Camp Cult, which was a lot of fun because I got to talk about some of the sillier films. Sequel-a-thon was a blast, where I got to cover the whole Universal Frankenstein series in depth, also the Halloween series and others. Then there was the 80s-a-thon, which was great, and then another sequel-a-thon where I got to cover everything from Gamera to Aliens. Since then, in later years, I just covered any random movies I could, knocking off lots of wishlist titles. If you're new to Monster Madness, I'd say definitely go back and check out the older reviews. Most of them are not on YouTube. Go on Cinemassacre.com and look it up on there. It was an awesome 10 years, and the only reason it was possible was because of all you showing your enthusiasm. I hope it piqued your interest with some movies that you'd enjoy. I hope it helped expand your movie knowledge, and likewise, I learned from all you too. But now I'm looking forward to new projects. I'll always be celebrating Halloween with you in some way. There will probably always be some kind of horror movie reviews on Halloween, but I currently have no more plans of doing a full 31 marathon. Instead, I will be using the time differently to bring to life some of my other ideas that have always been on halt. One possibility, I could be doing more movie reviews spread out throughout the year rather than all in October, and hopefully I can get started on a new film project. Halloween is a transitionary period, as we're about to cross over from the fall into the winter. Going all the way back to Halloween's origins, the festival of Samhain, this time of year is when the worlds of the living and the dead become closer. The crops were beginning to die, so this was a very creepy time back then. Some say that there were offerings and sacrifices made to bring good fortune. So today, I sacrifice Monster Madness to bring in a new, healthy harvest.